Bismillah wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum, dear viewers and listeners. Welcome to another exciting episode of the Scholar and the Student podcast, Botswana's first Muslim podcast. My name is Muhammad Mustaqim Hassan Rahat ibn Muhammad Ijaz Habib. That's why people just call me Moss, because no one can be bothered to remember things like that. But I hope you did at least remember some of it, because today's session is going to be so full of information that you might want to get your memory skills in order. Let me bring the profile picture of our esteemed guest up, and this is, by the way, going to filter in. I'm going to fade out, and now on your screen you guys should be seeing a picture of our guest. Look at that, mashallah. Let me read out a bit of his bio for you, so guys, please bear with me. So our guest today has recently successfully defended his PhD in sociology thesis, the title of which was The Role of Socio-Economic Factors in Influencing Religious Beliefs and Intergroup Attitudes of Muslim Majorities and Minorities. His research interests cover Quranic studies, Hadith literature, and the socio-economic experiences of Muslims. On top of all this, in Pakistan, he studied classical Islamic sciences with traditional scholars. Without any further ado, please welcome, or join me in welcoming to Botswana, I'm assuming for the very first time, albeit virtually, Dr. Syed Hammad Ali. Assalamu alaikum, Doc. How are you doing tonight? Well, it's night for me. How are you doing today?
Wa alaikum assalam, brother. I'm doing fine. It's not night here, so we have a time gap. Right now it's afternoon. And the weather is much better compared to a couple of weeks back when it was snowing. So, alhamdulillah, everything is good.
MashaAllah. So, just so you guys know, Doc is joining us all the way from the very cold place called Canada. It's not the coldest place on earth, but it's cold enough to make people like me, like Africans, think not twice, but 10 times about actually going there at all. But that's just us. So, Doc, by the way, some of you guys might know him or recognize him from Mindtrap with Mufti Abu Layth. And yes, Mufti Abu Layth, I am poaching your guest, as I did tell you that I would do. But Doc, we've gone through a bit of your bio. Could you, if you're willing to, elaborate more about this? How did you get into sociology? Can someone study sociology at a level that is not PhD? In other words, maybe there's someone listening to this who's in high school who is going to be interested in sociology after this episode. Will they be able to pursue it in a bachelor's level, master's level even? And also about your studies in Pakistan. Unfortunately, when you talk about Pakistan and Islam, there's always this loaded commentary about sects. Are you a Hanafi, Deobandi, Barelvi, blah, 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 blah. Some of my viewers and listeners don't know what the hell these are, but I'm sure you do. And so what kind of institution did you go to? How did that shape you? And are you a Maulana, is what people want to know. Should we call you Maulana Syed Hammad Ali instead of Doctor?
Thank you. First of all, you don't even have to call me Doctor or Maulana. You can just call me brother. That's fine. Wow. Secondly, sorry, when you had requested me to send you about my information about my education. I didn't mention that that the PhD that I've recently defended my thesis about. It's from University of Calgary, Canada. So I've done my my sociology is from the University of Calgary, the degree that I've just completed. So how did I go towards sociology? That's an interesting question. Because my background, that is my master's that I did a couple of master's degrees in human resource management and strategic management. So I did MPhil in human resource management from Pakistan, then MSc in strategic management from University of Lethbridge in Canada. So why this shift towards sociology? Well, here's the thing. It requires just a couple of minutes to explain this shift. So let me just briefly explain. Basically what happened was that from when I was in high school, I remember people would ask me questions about Islam, and I would look at I would see the Muslim community, and I would see all these different practices and different approaches towards Islam. So it made me curious as to what is Islam. And so I felt like, okay, I need to study about that. At that time, and this I'm talking about in late 90s and early 2000s, there wasn't much available books regarding Islamic studies in Canada, and the books that were available were pretty much published by the Salafi publishers. And clearly they do not embrace diversity in terms of different interpretation. So I was just getting one aspect or one interpretation of Islam, and yet I would see the Muslim community having different interpretations. So it made me curious as to what is Islam. So anyhow, after I completed my high school from Canada, I went back to Pakistan with my parents. And initially I was enrolled in a medical college. So I was about to be a doctor, as a medical doctor. And I was in my second year of MBBS when I decided, you know what, no, I want to study what Islam is. And so I thought the best approach would be to go and study in a madrasa. My parents, unlike many perhaps parents, my parents were wonderful that they actually allowed me. They allowed me and they encouraged me, but they always encouraged me that acquire knowledge. Do not become dogmatic. Acquire knowledge to find the truth, not to debate. And so those were the things that inculcated me. And with this frame of mind, I went and I left madrasa. I left medical college. I studied in a madrasa. The madrasa that I studied with, the founder, the chancellor, you can say, was Mufti Abu Khan, rahimullah, who recently passed away.
Yeah.
So I thought I would find knowledge there. And what I noticed is that the Islamic seminaries, at least the ones that are in Pakistan perhaps, there is less focus on contextualizing the texts, understanding why there are differences, and they tend to be more towards engaging in polemical discussions, which I feel is not healthy. And so I then realized that, if I would spend 8 years there, I would study from one school of thought. So I did actually study initially in the Hanafi madrasa, but then I went to al-Hadith madrasa. And interestingly, you would find that they at times use the same books, like for example, but the way they would contextualize it, it's just to support their school of thought. And the problem where I was facing is that, again, I'm seeing all these diverse views, and I'm thinking, why did they merge? Now, one approach that would be taken the madrasa is that our approach is right, others is wrong. But that still didn't, for me at least, justify this, because I'm thinking like, okay, we have so many different aspects. Like even the issue, let's take the basic issue of prayers. We know how the companions offered prayers differently. We know Umar radiallahu anhu, he offered just like the Hanafis, that is without raful yadayn, without continuous raising of the hands. And yet his son did it, as mentioned in Musannaf ibn Abi Shayba. And then here's the thing, both are companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and yet they pray differently. Why is there so much clash as to how we pray? Either they didn't know how to pray, or either both of them received this mode of praying from the Prophet of Islam. So therefore, either both practices are right, or they didn't know. And so these are the questions that were still in my mind, and I didn't find that in Islamic seminaries. So then I started to study one-on-one with Shayukh. And in this way, I was able to get Hadith Ijaza from Dr. Abdul Shahid Nomani, who is the son of the great Muhaddis, Sheikh Abdul Rashid al-Nomani. I studied with him. I studied Arabic with another teacher. I studied fiqh with another teacher, and so on. And meanwhile, I completed my MPhil degree in human resource management. I returned back to Canada, and I pursued strategic management. And these questions are still in my mind. Why are there differences and all that? And then I still remember there was this book that we studied for strategic management, which is the title of the book was like Economic Meets Sociology in Strategic Management. And then the more I started studying, I'm like realizing, the answers to why there are differences, what are the factors that are influencing, can be understood from a sociological perspective. And so I was fortunate to get admission at the University of Calgary, and that's where I have completed I successfully defended my PhD thesis.
MashaAllah, MashaAllah. Very loaded, mashallah, and I cannot just bring myself to comment on that because it's just so over my pay grade. And by the way, audience and viewers, if you see me or you listen to me being made to look out like a fool in front of Dr. Syed here, it's because I actually am. I can't compete with this man, at least not yet. But that's why I'm here, actually. That's why I got him on, because I want to learn, and mashallah, Allah has blessed Doc with so much knowledge in many different fields, and we've had so many conversations, by the way, at this point. They've all been so full of gems. I wish I could share them with you, but this is the first one that's being recorded. So I was even telling him before we started, like, we always have great conversations. Can we get at least one recorded, Doc? So, okay, how long did this did the study of Islam take, Doc? Was it, since you studied various places and with one-on-one shuyukh at the same time, you also pursued your master's in human resources and so on and so forth. How long was that entire journey? If we just look at the Islamic sciences part of your journey, how long was that? How many years?
So we can say from 2003 to 2012 and 13. So 10 years, that's that whole process. That's the time I completed my first master's degree, MPhil in human resource management. So that was just one phase, I would say, because during this time, I was just studying the sciences that can be considered as the transmitted sciences. What do I mean by that? Transmitted sciences that are the al-Maliki. Basically, transmitted sciences are like hadith and fiqh. So you're studying these books. But then I was fortunate when I came to Canada, and while I'm pursuing my second master's degree, I met a professor who started teaching me al-Maliki, that is the intellectual sciences, Muslim philosophy, metaphysics, and this is another journey that since I would believe is 5 years now, the studying of Muslim philosophy and all that. So in this way, I've been fortunate. First, I studied transmitted knowledge, then I've studied intellectual knowledge. So yeah, and during this time, I was also fortunate to work on some books. So for example, in Pakistan, we have an O-level system, educational system. So there are two books that have been endorsed by Cambridge International Examination. One of them is mine. So that is being used in Pakistan. And there's a hadith book which was published in UK by Turat publishers known as Asarus Sunan. So Asarus Sunan is a book of hadith using justifying Hanafi's position through narrations. Imam Nimawi was Rahimullah, he was the scholar who wrote that book. And so you can say the evaluation of the chain of transmission that was done by me. So that was also published. So this was part of my journey for the transmitted sciences.
Wow, mashallah. So you could say a solid decade in a way. And by the way, we also have not O-levels. They're not called that in this part of the world, but from the same Cambridge University, we've got what we call IGCSEs. Okay. So yeah, it's very possible that, I mean, which subject was this for? Is it what they call Islamiyat in Pakistan?
Yes.
Or? Okay, yeah.
Islamiyat. If I'm not mistaken, the syllabus is 2058. So they have Islamiyat O levels. So they have endorsed two books. It's on their website. So one was mine.
Oh, mashallah.
That was, yeah.
Mashallah. Because, yeah, I also briefly flirted with the idea of taking, whether it's called Islamiyat in the IGCSE world or Islamic sciences or something, but I did flirt with the idea of taking that on for my IGCSEs or A-levels. Unfortunately, you see, you have to concentrate on your actual like core subjects as well if you want to get into university. So unfortunately, I didn't actually pursue that. But it's interesting that I could have been acquainted with yourself, Doc, much earlier. But, you know, it's all qudratullah. But coming back to sociology, first of all, could you elucidate on what exactly is meant by sociology? I'm sure there are plenty of definitions out there, and you can even break down or disregard the definition that I'm going to try and give. So at a very simple level, it's the study of people and the societies that they live in. I know that's very simplistic, but of course you can elucidate. And building off this, I wanted to ask you an interesting question. You see, I watch a lot of YouTubers in Japan, and many of them are foreigners. For example, you've got Paulo in Tokyo. So I think he's from South America, Latin America or something, but now he's married to a Japanese woman and blah, 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 blah. So he's got a series of videos where he basically shows the day in the life of a typical Japanese person. So a typical Japanese salaryman, a typical Japanese housewife, a typical Japanese, delivery worker, all that kind of stuff. Now, in sociology, this is not the prime method of getting information or data collection, but it is something that occasionally, time and time again, sociologists will use to get whatever information that they're seeking. Do you think that this sort of YouTube videos or this sort of vlogging has a sort of niche that is carving out, or as time goes on, the sociologists will look towards videos such as these and content creators such as these as an invaluable source of information? Obviously, you're an academic and you will put published papers, peer-reviewed journals over a couple of YouTube videos, but I'm just asking that out of interest.
So regarding the definition, one can become technical and just say, and in fact, I have in front of me, which says sociology is the systematic or scientific study of society. But I really like what you just said. This is simply, rather than using these technical words, let's try to explain what sociology does. right? We can talk about sociology is, it can be defined as the social science that studies the development, structure, and functioning of human society. Again, that doesn't give much of an understanding what it does. This is what it does. It tries to understand the society. It tries to understand the social patterns that are emerging through the intersection of social variables, social institutions. So what it means is that how can social interactions, for example, between group members influence one's positions? How can societal institution influence one's individual position about a given societal issue? So what sociology does is that it's trying to look at the interactions between individuals, groups, and the society, and how that is shaping an individual's social reality. Because my looking of the reality might be different than yours because we have different socio-economic experiences. And that in turn leads me to look at the world from a different reality. And it will be true for me, but may not be true for you. And so what we try to find is what are the general trends and patterns that are emerging in the society or amongst individuals? And how do individuals contextualize their lived experiences in such a way that they're able to understand? They're looking at the society, and based on that, they are then also giving their opinions. So in other words, sociology, it's looking at basically not just looking at it's contextualizing societal institutions with groups, with individuals. So, for example, if you look at religion, I mentioned about this interaction. Research shows that when people befriend members of other groups, they tend to hold more tolerant attitudes towards others. So it's not surprising to find that those Muslims who have non-Muslim friends, they're more likely to believe in an inclusive sociological interpretation. That is that they would say that it is not just Islam that leads to salvation in the hereafter, but other religions can also. So those are the things we, as sociologists can find, the trends, for example. Not just that, also to explain how the community looks at their world. So, for example, we're talking about these YouTube channels and all that. It's interesting. This is part of my own, hopefully future research. I plan to look at how our Muslim influencers on YouTube, for example, on a certain topic, let's say the issue of hijab. So you can look at all these YouTubers, those who are blogging, and then you can see, okay, what are the trends that are emerging? Like, for example, if someone takes a Salafist approach, what approach are they taking to justify their position? What are their educational background in terms, have they acquired education from a secular university or not? Now, if someone had take an example, if there was an individual who studied in an Islamic institute and then studies in a Ivy League university, and then their views are changing, then again, you can understand maybe there's the effect of educational institution on them. So now what you can do is a research like before they had studied in a secular university, how they spoke, as in the position they were taking, the evidence they were using, and how now they're contextualizing the evidence. So this can become a really resource for scholars to look at how the Muslim community is evolving through looking at how the Muslims are giving their position on a certain matter, whether it is the issue of hijab, whether it's the issue, it's not an issue, but the topic of hijab, the topic of imamat, and all those stuff.
MashaAllah, that's very interesting. And I like the part that you mentioned about the more Muslims interact or befriend people from other faiths, the more they are open to interpretations such as the ones that derail or that stray away from this vision of salvific exclusivity. And that's a big word for some of my audience. Basically, salvific exclusivity means when you believe that it's only one religion, for example, that's going to be saved and entered into heaven, and so on and so forth. And we can get more deeply into this, but I was just making a point that in my country, in Botswana, for example, so the Muslim community is not very old. It's actually quite fledgling, quite young compared to other places such as the UK, such as the United States. And obviously, you've got Islamic countries such as Morocco and all the Islamic world, if you can call them that. We don't hold a candle to them. But it's interesting that a huge chunk, maybe 90% of the Muslim population here, I would say, is of immigrant descent, myself included in that. My father's side, my father's patrilineal lineage can be traced back at least as far back as I've gone to Kolkata in India. But then you see the interesting thing is that Kolkata, and you can correct me on this, I always say people can call me out, but that is quote unquote the most British place in India, as in it's got the most European flavor out of most Indian cities. And in the way that my dad raised me and the way that my parents raised me, there was always this attitude of including others, as opposed to the rest of the Muslim community, for example, who have these very, I don't want to use derogatory terms, but what many people dismiss as Indian village type mentalities. And I'm sure you know exactly what I'm getting at, Doc. But it's interesting that you mentioned all this, that these all play a major role in shaping one's worldview, in shaping one's understanding of religion even. But coming back to sociology once again, how do you as sociologists actually access this data? Is it a scientific process or is it more arbitrary? For example, when we spoke about the YouTube videos and how they got information on different groups and so on and so forth, I mean, yeah, that is one way of getting information, but obviously it's not subject to the same checks and balances as a peer-reviewed article. So how do you sociologists access their data? How do they collect data? How do they interpret data?
Right. So there are two approaches that one can take within sociological field, the quantitative approach and the qualitative approach. And then a combination of them is a mixed method. So for example, what happens is that we have secondary data. Now, you have an example of Pew Survey. Pew Survey, this is a non-profit organization. It takes a neutral approach. It doesn't have any opinion. It's like taking an approach, it's just presenting the data. So then it depends on one's theory, one's interpretative framework. And based on that, then they would utilize the data. So that is one approach. Like the example about sociology, exclusivity, inclusivity one. As an example, part of my research that I've done, I looked at American Muslims' attitudes towards salvation. That is, do they think only Muslims will obtain salvation in the hereafter, or both Muslims and non-Muslims? That is it only Islam that leads to salvation, or other religions can lead to salvation? So there was this question, and there was another question regarding friendship network. So because I knew a theory known as intergroup contact theory, I thought, okay, can I, based on this, look at this data? And I found correlation, association. So then we do these, we do this quantitative approach we run predictive modeling. In my case, I ran logistic regression. That is one aspect. Then we have a qualitative approach whereby we can interview. So for example, part of my ongoing research is that I've interviewed Muslim participants in my province, which is Alberta, and so you have a set of questions, and basically the one approach is that you have a set of questions, you have a questionnaire, you ask them to fill in, you have a Likert scale, or you have 1 to 5 range, whereby on a certain question, 1 means that you do not agree, 5 means you agree. And once you have the data, then you can start asking them. In this way, what is happening is that you're asking them the reasons behind their position that they have taken. So now what happens is that if you have a quantitative part and you have a qualitative part, and they're showing some, again, general pattern, common themes, then there is something to it. Now, what it means is that there is this connection and further research is required. And that's why research is ongoing. But this is the way one can take approach. That is through qualitative approach or through quantitative approach, or then combine both of them.
Wow, interesting. And are these methods of getting data, or sociological data in general, can it also be subject to quote-unquote scientific inquiry? So, for example, if you take the Karl Popper approach, if I can even call it that, so when he spoke of Sigmund Freud and Albert Einstein, so basically he classified Einstein's work as science and Sigmund Freud's work as pseudoscience. Not that I think anyone uses that terminology to refer to psychology today, but anyway, what he was getting at is, and I'm simplifying it, with pseudoscience, it seeks to prove that it actually is true. Whereas with science, you're constantly looking for ways to disprove your theory. And if your theory stands the test of all these attacks, if you will, that you're going to throw at it, and it stands the test of time, then your theory is true. So does that also apply to sociological data, or am I completely off the mark here?
So no, that's a it's a good explanation of how science can be used for trying to find what is there compared to what trying to say that this is it. Sociology, when it came into the, when it became a growing discipline, there was this positivist approach that was taken. So positivism had a central role. But then later on, there was recognition that, people have different standpoints. And that is why there has been a shift from quantitative to qualitative within sociology as well. And then the understanding was that, look, if you're coming from different approaches, that is quantitative, qualitative, you are taking different approaches. That means the evidence you're getting is more solid as compared to taking just one approach. And there's a recognition that there are multiple truths. In other words, if one wants to say, there isn't that the truth, and things will change and evolve. Science, as in like hard sciences, is different than social sciences, because in social sciences you have humans who have agency, who are not fixed variables. So there is that recognition that we are trying to understand, but we cannot say that this is it. Does that help?
Oh yeah, no, it definitely helps me. I hope it is serving as a good explanation to the viewers as well. But when you talk about there being multiple truths, isn't that something of a self-defeating statement? Because if I say, as a Muslim, I believe God is one, and that is the truth, that God is one. And then you've got a polytheist who believes that, no, there are a million types of God out there. So how do you reconcile with the statement that God is one, this is a true statement, and then the statement that there are millions of gods being true as well? How does a sociologist begin to reconcile with these two opposing statements?
Right. So the sociologist, so in this case, for example, I'm speaking from a sociological perspective. I'm not taking a religious faith-based approach. Sociologist is recording, and you have to recognize for each individual, their truth is what they think it to be. That does not mean that it is the truth. Now, you have claimed Muslim statement is the truth. Well, there are those who might oppose this view, that you think, for example, you're stating that this is the truth. Now, how this is tackled, that's another level. And that's, we were speaking about one day with regards to the Akbarian perspective. But from a sociological perspective, if you want to understand this, what you have to do is that you have to let the voices of the people be recorded and to then disseminate, to spread and explain how they see the world. Because how a person assumes Islam, that is how, once they understand that this is the understanding of Islam, or this is the Islamic interpretation that is right, they're going to use that interpretation as a supporting structure, whereby then they're going to engage with the society through that filter, through this Islamic interpretation that they are thinking is the truth. Now, with that way, that this interpretation that they think is valid, its outcome would be different on issues. For a person who takes a conservative approach, for example, there are many things that person may not agree to compared to someone who takes a more, who takes a liberal position or a liberal perspective. So sociology is going to show what are the trends happening. It's going to record voices, but it's not going to say this is it. It embraces diversity. And so for a lot of people, then the question comes, you think about this. We're talking about the salvation. If it is established that friendship with out-group members, that is, those who are not part of one's community, so in this case, Muslims befriending non-Muslims, leads to them holding views that is contrary to the majoritarian view in the Muslim world, because of the data I looked at is American Muslim, and to the dominant position in the classical Muslim theology, then the question comes, what is Islam?
Absolutely.
Because their socio-economic reality has influenced them. And they're holding a view, majority of them, by the way, majority of American Muslims take this position. Then the question comes that why is it, we know why they are, perhaps we know that they're opposing the dominant position, the classical time, or among the classical Muslim theology. But then the question comes, who is right? That is not the job of sociologists to say, oh, this is right or this is wrong. This is to record why this is happening, how are socioeconomic factors influencing. And therefore then this is a question that, we need to then figure out, and then Muslims have to wonder which interpretation is right. Islam is a series of interpretation, or any other religion. There are a series of interpretation. Because even the notion of religion, from a sociology of religion, literatures, There's an argument that is made, which is a strong argument, that how do you even substantively define religion? What is religion?
Wow, very, very profound. But wouldn't you say, Doc, that there is a need, at least I'm looking at it from a Muslim perspective because I am Muslim, I cannot speak for other faiths, but there is a need to delimit or at least put a boundary on what religion can be. For example, we've got many interpretations, as we mentioned when we started, about how to pray, the positions of prayer and all that. For the most part, that may not cause so much of a stir. But what if tomorrow, and I'm just putting out a hypothetical situation, tomorrow Muslims started believing that, well, to achieve salvation, you would need to go through Jesus Christ. Now, this is obviously not in line with the message of Islam, if you will, or it's a hard departure from what is known as traditional Islam, if I can even use that terminology. It's not, going to all these what we call the fiqhi opinions of how much alcohol can a drink have before it's deemed to be haram and all these kind of minute issues. Now we're going to an issue of belief. So wouldn't there be a need to somehow define a limit to what can be and cannot be a valid interpretation of Islam? And we'll say specifically Islam here, but you can of course give other faiths as an example.
So as a sociologist, I would be looking at how the community is delimiting. But the thing is, even the delimiting, it is simply intersubjective agreement. And subjective agreement differs and changes. So even the delimitation that is being put, a sociologist perhaps might look at what are the power dynamics at play. What is the institutional support given for a certain position as compared to another position? So even the idea of tradition, someone might say, what is traditional? You have traditional understanding that takes a more Sufi approach, but then you have a traditional understanding that takes a more Salafist approach. So even the idea of then tradition is something that, can be asked, what is tradition? Again, these are things that are, from a sociological perspective, I would be recording. I would say these are the positions that are being found. And I would be interested in what are the factors. Now, this question about going through Jesus, someone might say that in Islam, again, look at the issue of intercession in Islam. Some Muslim communities are, they permit it, and some Muslim scholars, they disallow it. So someone would say that, we can do intercession through the righteous people and the righteous prophets. So is not Jesus a righteous prophet?
Absolutely. Yeah, he is.
But then you have another community, another Muslim community who would say intercession is polytheism. Yet both would claim they are Muslims. So if someone is looking at them, that person, the researcher, how can that individual researcher say, this is Islam and that is not Islam? No. Perhaps that person would be saying, this is one way of understanding Islam and that is another way of understanding Islam.
Okay, so basically from a sociological perspective, there's no such thing as a wrong understanding of Islam or anything else.
Yeah, because if the person is claiming to be a Muslim, and the person will find evidence from the authoritative Islamic scriptures, then the job of sociology is not to say this is the right opinion or wrong opinion, but simply to explain the type of patterns that are emerging in the Muslim community and figure out what are the patterns, what are the factors leading to that pattern.
Okay, wow, that's interesting. Okay, so if I may speak to you, Doc, as if we can forget for a second that you're a sociologist, as a Muslim who wants to practice Islam, which I'm sure that you are, someone of that nature, how would you approach these things? Because yes, you're a sociologist, you don't try to skew the data this way or that way, but in your practical life, if this is not too much of a personal question, what's your approach to deciding that I'm going to follow this belief or not?
So that's where, when I mentioned about the transmitted sciences, and your question, perhaps I may not answer immediately, but during the talk, I might. It depends on how everything is emerging, but I need to first explain. And now this is my position that I take as well. I am taking, not I take all the time, perhaps, but not even all the time, but like that I do embrace it. Let's put it that way. Yeah. So when we look at Islam from a transmitted science, that is Islam as understood through the transmitted science, there are challenges in it. And a lot of times, in the Sunni world at least, this has been an issue, and that is why there has been difficulty perhaps for embracing diversity amongst the more religious amongst the more religious members of the community. Now, these are questions that everyone faces. So, for example, let's look at this issue. And when I'll give you an example that I always quote. I even quoted during Mufti Abu Layth, and I'm going to quote it with you as well. A friend of mine came from Pakistan. So in Pakistan, majority of people believe that only Muslims will attain salvation. And even within that, there are different opinion, because then the Sunnis would say, our group, and within Sunniism, there's Deobandi, Barelwis, and Ahlul-Hadith. And, then they start criticizing each other, let alone the differences that unfortunately are present in among Pakistani Sunnis and Shias. So now what happens is that this person comes to Lethbridge. He's studying at the university. It's been 2 or 3 years now that he has been in Canada. And one day he asks me, he says, Hamad Bhai, he calls me Hamad brother, Hamad Bhai, tell me something. I've met these wonderful non-Muslims who have helped me settle down in Canada, who explained to me, about different processes, social institutions, all that about them. So they have helped me integrate into the society. What will happen to such good people? Amongst these non-Muslims were both atheists and people of other faith. Now, the standard approach given would be, they will get the good in this dunya, and in the hereafter they would be, hell awaits them. That's the general interpretation. But the philosophical side of Islam, if one may say, or the Sufi approach, and Sufi is part of Islam. If someone says that Sufi is not, that's problematic, because Islam, there are 3 aspects of Islam, as in the hadith of Jibreel, that the Prophet of Islam was asked about what is Islam, what is Iman, and what is Ihsan. Now, regarding Islam, 5 prayers, Hajj, and all that is covered by fiqh. Regarding Iman, that is covered by theology, kalam. The last part was about Ihsan. And the Prophet of Islam was asked about Ihsan, and he explained something like this or like that, because Muslims tend to be careful when they say something in terms of what the Prophet said. So it was told to the companions regarding Ihsan that you worship God as if you see Him. And if you do not see Him, know that He sees you. So the Sufis have taken this approach. That is, the Sufi understanding is in relation to this Ihsan component. Now, this Ihsan component, unfortunately, is missing in the Muslim world, it seems. There's a lot of focus on fiqh, on narrations and all that, but not this part. So this aspect, when you look at it, then when you see these multiplicity in the world, you can explain it through metaphysics, Islamic metaphysics. You can explain it through the Akbarian philosophy, that is Ibn Arabi. You can explain it through the Sadrian philosophy, that is Mullah Sadras. Now, in case of this issue, like if you look at this question that I mentioned about my friend, well, or one can look at it from this way, that which Ibn Arabi says, that which is quite solid, I would say, is that you have to first of all understand that the Quran says that God has revealed the Quran in Arabiyyun Mubin. Now, Lisanun Arabiyyun Mubin, what does that mean? Mubin means manifest, clear, open. And so Ibn Arabi says that this would be discourteous towards the divine if you read the Quran without reading it in a literal manner. But the literal manner, when you read according to Akbarian perspective, is that it leads to multiple opinions, because Arabic words that are rooted, the root words, they have diverse meanings. They have diverse meanings. The word raham, right, which is generally translated as merciful, well, it also means compassion, mercy, benefit, goodness, forgiveness, right? So it has that context. So Ibn Arabi would say, read this, if you read the Quran in such a way that is true to its literal reading, Then you're showing courteous to the divine, because the divine says this is revealed in manifest Arabic, in clear Arabic. Sorry, it's in revealing clear Arabic. So once you read it in this approach and you see an interpretation, you can embrace it. So there's a Quranic verse which says that among those who, it says something along this line, the believers, Christian, Jewish, Sabians, all of those who believe in God and the last day, they will not suffer, nor shall they grieve. Interestingly, if you notice, it's not just here that it's being saying Muslims only. What is it saying? Believers, and believers are related in how the scholar explains believers, means the Muslims here, believers, those who believe, Jews, Christians, Sabians, whosoever believes in God and the day of judgment, no fear shall come upon them, nor shall they grieve. Now, someone might say this verse has been abrogated, mansukh, because other verse came that only Islam is the truth. The problem in this approach is that God's promise are not abrogated. God's laws can be abrogated, but not his promises. That's the difference. Now, if someone reads this way, then they find, okay, this is accepting. But more important, we have to also recognize one thing, that whatever position anyone is taking, one should always have good opinions about people. One needs to show mercy. Islam is a religion of mercy. Now, these diverse views all reflect the self-disclosure of the divine. And that's something other that we can talk later on. But the point is that you need to, and this is the thing that the Muslim community needs to recognize, that Islam is a religion of peace and mercy. And the reason I say that is because based on such verses, as an example, where God has said that he has decreed mercy upon himself, right? It says that basically, we know that except for one surah, all the surahs start with compassionate, he's the all merciful. But moreover, God himself has said, Kataba Rabbakum ala nafsihi rahma. He has decreed mercy upon himself. And he wants ease for us. And then he also says that my mercy encompasses everything. So we need to take that approach. And when we take that approach, we are more then able to embrace diversity as well.
Wow.
That is an approach I would prefer to take. That I recognize that there is mercy everywhere, and that there are differences of opinion because people are coming from. So when I've taken this, I acknowledge that there is mercy everywhere. What do? Now I would say, you know what? If a person is holding opinion, it's because of their socio-economic environment that is influencing them. I need to be more. I need to show more empathy towards why a person may hold such a view, whereby in fact, the person may even criticize me, call me a deviant, which has happened. But I need to recognize why that person is coming from, because it's his education that has influenced him.
I mean, you've wrapped it all up so well, mashallah. But from this, a new question emerges, is that are there not harmful interpretations of Islam? Although I think you've kind of answered it with the mercy aspect. For example, if someone believes that if you leave Islam, then you are punishable by death. And there are countries we know for a fact in the world where this is an actual law. If it comes out to the public that you are no longer a Muslim, then you could very well be tried and actually lose your life. So you can say that, yeah, I understand where that interpretation is coming from, but at the same time, you understand that that's a very harmful interpretation which is resulting in loss of life. And if you don't say anything about something like that, then the problem is going to fester, is it not?
Yes, and that's where the mercy component comes. When you see such rulings or such laws that are creating problem for people, that's where you step in and say this is not right, because the mercy prevails. You know, there's a hadith that says, God's mercy prevails over his wrath. So the interpretation should be, yes, it should match with the Quran, but then it also needs to express mercy. Where mercy is not there, that ruling should not be promoted. That ruling should not be allowed. If we talk about apostasy, look at how Muslim scholars, but more importantly, and now I'm shifting to sociological approach. If you want, and the reason I'm taking the sociological approach is because people say, oh, this is the essence of Islam, look, apostasy. let's argue for the sake of argument. This was the standard approach, though there was always difference of opinion. There were minor views that did not hold this view in the past. I'm talking about the classical period. If you want that more liberal, open, tolerant interpretations of Islam are being spread, perhaps the best approach is not to say that Muslims need to study and reinterpret their text. No, the way would be to change the Muslim socio-economic environment in such a way that they're economically settled, they're able to interact with people of other faiths, because research constantly shows that those who are more economically stable and those who have more friendship network outside of their own community, they tend to hold more liberal opinions. So going back to the salvation, look at those who had non-Muslims as friends. They held this view that other religions can lead to salvation. Now that in turn would have an effect on how religion is being interpreted. They would go to the Quranic text, and the way I explained to you how that God's promise cannot be abrogated, it cannot be revoked, only God's laws, that's the type of interpretation they would take. So it is important then to distinguish between, oh, this is Islam, and this is the problem that a number of critics of Islam take by assuming a monolithic interpretation of Islam. No, there are diverse interpretations of Islam. Now they would say, oh, this is the dominant theme, as you mentioned, like they're in the Muslim countries. But then look at the data and see how many of these individuals are economically struggling, who hold this view, and do not have non-Muslims as friends. So it is important that if we need to change the minds of Muslims, we need to provide them a socio-economic structure whereby they're able to benefit from the economic developments of our society, and at the same time they're able to interact with people of other communities as well.
Wow, mashallah. But on this mercy point, Doc, can we then somehow delimit mercy, or at least not to limit the mercy of God, but for our own understanding's sake, because people can have different interpretations of what mercy is. For example, one person might say that euthanasia is merciful because the person is, what they say in medical terms, he's a vegetable. There's no hope for this guy ever going back to normalcy. So the most merciful thing to do is to let him die with euthanasia or whatever it is, put some injection, however they do euthanasia. On the other hand, someone might say that no, killing a person is always unmerciful. So you should not engage in the act of euthanasia. So how then do we reconcile? Which is the merciful approach here?
So, for example, there are some people who are suffering chronic problems and they do want some assistance regarding ending their life. There are some people who might say that, no, this isn't allowed, but then again, you might find that this is the case. And this is where whole dialogue happens. Some questions, at the end of the day, some questions from, one cannot define, even religiously speaking, that this is right or wrong. And taking that sociological approach right now, I would be interested in looking how Muslims are looking at these views. And I would then again look at their patterns as to how their socio-economic realities are supporting. I wouldn't be surprised those who come from economically struggling, for example, or those who are taking a conservative approach, they might not embrace such a position, as you mentioned, compared to those. So these are things that are going to be discussing and evolving. And that is where, again, exactly, if someone would say, what is the Islamic position on that? It's problematic. What is the Islamic position? So, but again, what one needs to do constantly, at least in their practice, is to find what is merciful. And that doesn't just come from recognizing my interpretation. So this person is saying my interpretation of mercy is right. No, you have to see how others are understanding mercy, how the other community is understanding mercy. You need to put yourself in other person's position as well. Because if you're not putting the other person, if you're not putting yourself in other person's position, that again, you're not showing that level of mercy, because that requires understanding how the other person is coming. And decisions are then made through consultation, through understanding. Now, the outcome, whether this is right or wrong, cannot be determined from a religious perspective, because the interpretations are subjected to subjectivity itself. So even I acknowledge that you say like these questions, even now someone might say, well, my mercy is this, meaning that mercy is that. Well, that's my question to you then. What is religion? Because even this, how can you use this idea of mercy to even explain Islamic position? You cannot then.
Oh,
And so the reality is that religion and religious understanding, religious interpretation will remain ambiguous.
no, subhanAllah. I guess you're saying in a way that with religious interpretations remaining ambiguous, that's just the nature of the game. And that's just the nature of quote unquote religion, if you will.
That's the nature of creation. Now, the question then comes is that so again, as you can see, I'm trying to shift between sociological perspective and religious perspective. So here from a religious perspective, how do you understand ambiguous? Ibn Arabi would explain, you have to understand something. It's only God who is al-haq. ذَلِكَ بِأَنَّ اللَّهُ هُوَ الْحَقُّ. Right? And what it means is that when we talk about the meaning of haq means reality, truth, something there is. So anything other than the divine, which is creation, basically the whole creation, it's not real. It's not haq in a way, it's batil. Yet at the same time, it is also haq. And there's that ambiguous position one is in. Because the divine is wajib al-wujud, and the creation that is present here within us, it is mumkin, it is possible being. And so the possible being, it has two types of characteristic. One, that it is absolutely nothing, so that's falsehood. And then it got its loan of beingness from the necessary being. So this ambiguity will always remain. And this is what Ibn Arabi also acknowledges, ambiguity will always remain. So the best course of action is always to then read the Quran from a literal way, but the hyperliteralism that Ibn Arabi takes does not lead to a conservative opinion, you might say, or a Salafist opinion approach. Rather, it leads to an acceptance of multiple interpretations, because in Arabic, one word can have multiple meanings. So in this way, what happens is that then Ibn Arabi says that one's interpretation, if he was sincere in that sense, the person was sincere by reading it literally as what God has stated, because lisanun Arabiyyun mubin. And then there's the mercy component as well. This person can follow that opinion, but it is not necessary that I follow his opinion.
MashaAllah, MashaAllah. So that's a lot for us to think on. So, Doc, one more general question on sociology before we delve in to your work proper, and you mentioned Ibn Arabi, we'll come to him as well. Although I think this general sociological question ties into your work in a big way. Do you think it's helpful at all to classify Islamic opinions as conservative and liberal? Because some of these quote-unquote liberal positions can be traced back to companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him. So when Imam Abu Hanifa talks about nabidh and Omar radiallahu anhu, how he used to, nabidh is for those who don't understand, it's a semi or mild sort of alcoholic drink, but you have to drink a whole lot before you actually start getting tipsy. So when Imam Abu Hanifa brings the evidence that Omar radiallahu anhu, he used to like the stronger nabidhs. So this is a companion of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Are you then going to say that, oh, this is liberal Islam and so on and so forth? Is it even a helpful dichotomy, conservative and liberal, when we talk about Islam? Or is that something that should be exclusive to classifying politics? Because there it makes sense, but here you kind of go all over the place.
Right. So there's a spectrum, but to have a spectrum, you need to have two ends. So those two ends we have to define. Whenever we're having a dialogue or a discussion on anything, we're always defining. And when we define something, that definition would have its opposite definition as well. So for example, if I say I'm Canadian, that implies that I could have also been non-Canadian. I could have been from another. So these are concepts that we use for conversations. But the problem is also that the moment we create concepts, they can delimit our thinking. And that's where it is problematic. Let's look at Salafis, for example. A lot of times scholars say the Salafist approach, and that's why I was hesitant to even take this as saying Salafist approach, because I recognize within Salafism, there's diverse interpretations. Those that are closer to the liberal position and then there are those that are quite extreme in their interpretation. But the reason we use these words is that it conceptualizes the engagement, the dialogue that we're having, or when we're having, generally speaking. So when we are saying like, okay, you give the example of Nabis. By the way, the narrations can be found for supporting in Kitabul Asar of Abu Hanifa. Scholars say that it was, scholars claim it to be more, they attribute to Imam Muhammad ibn Hassan Shaybani, his student. But generally, as Abdul Rashid al-Nomani has shown and Abul Wafa Afghani, this book can be attributed to Abu Hanifa. Abu Hanifa's actual name was Noman ibn Thabit. So the Nabi's evidence can be found in Kitabul Asar. Which then again brings interesting, can one drink beer based on that interpretation, right? And if someone says it's not allowed, well, the question comes, why then, based on these interpretations? Anyhow, coming back to this question of classifying, categorizing, it is how we do, this is the convention, but we need to always recognize that there's always going to be a nuance. There's always going to be a nuance. For example, majority Muslims say we follow the Quran and Sunnah. But then if we go deeper into understanding this, so they have conceptualized, when they say, okay, what is Islam? They say to follow the Quran and Sunnah. They have conceptualized what Islam is, at least the source of Islam. But then, how is Quran interpreted? How is Hadith embraced? Which type of Hadith is accepted? Some school of thoughts, they do not accept Mursal Riwayat. Some do. Some don't accept the companions. Some don't accept the Tabi'in statement. Some do, right? But this is the way we generally discuss. So that's why, for better or worse, we are saying that there's a conservative group and then there's a liberal group.
Okay.
Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it definitely does, and it makes sense if you're putting it that way. So now coming to your specific PhD thesis, which Doc just defended at his university a couple of weeks ago. That's one of the reasons why we postponed this to record it when we are. So you uncovered quite a few findings there, Doc, which may go against the common conception of what Muslims believe or so on and so forth. And the reason why I was asking about this whole conservative liberal thing before I got onto this is, would you also, from your findings, would your findings also corroborate this, that it seems that there's a push from quote-unquote conservative Muslims to fall in line with, in the USA, for example, the Conservative Party or conservative politics? Because I'll give you an example. I won't mention names, but even on Instagram, when this recent American election happened, the one where Joe Biden won, and I don't want to start a new political war on who actually won, but whatever, Joe Biden is the president now. But this Imam, and he is an Imam, he's like classically trained and everything. And he actually did say that, no, I voted for the GOP, which is the Conservative Party for those who are unacquainted, because of reasons X, Y, and Z. And there seems to be a lot of pushback from the Muslim community now. I mean, traditionally, if I can even say traditionally, in the last, let's say decade, many Muslims have been sort of seen on the liberal side of the fence because, the liberals love everyone, they embrace everyone, however different they may be, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, they embrace people that Muslims traditionally wouldn't embrace. For example, the LGBTQ community and so on and so forth. So that's why there's a pushback from conservative Muslims to say, no, we should stand up for family values. We should stand up for women being in their place and men acting like men and going away from this whole gender choice thing and all those things that maybe some people don't even understand. And I acknowledge that there are liberals who have wacko views. We're talking about political liberals that got wacko views. But at the same time, Muslims also want to distance themselves from the racist rhetoric that may emerge and the populist narrative that may emerge from the conservative side. So what have your findings said about this particular situation? And are there any other interesting findings that you've come across while you were doing your PhD?
So my research did not look at the political issue and American Muslims' views regarding politics. But one thing before I go towards the type of research I did, the reality is that we have to, and this is also a mistake at times we do, that we classify Muslim community based on what a Muslim cleric is saying. The reality is that for many people, the opinion of Muslim cleric doesn't hold that much weight. In fact, and I'll explain this through a historical context, when Muslims started to migrate in the outside, they were leaving the Muslim land and they were coming to Europe and North America. So in classical Islamic definition, there is, Darul Islam and Darul Harb. Darul Islam is the land of Muslims. Anything not that, that's Darul Harb. This is, again, there's nuance in that. Then there is further definition. But generally speaking, that was the way. Muslim scholars, if you read the classical sources, it wasn't allowed to migrate to non-Muslim countries. Yet Muslims were migrating. Now, there are millions of Muslims living in Europe and North America. And one scholar acknowledged that, look, even if we say that it is, something along this line, they said, like, even if we give an opinion that does not support their living or that does not support what they want, they won't listen to us. So a lot of fatwas are retroactive rationalization of the reality that is that the Muslim clerics have realized that, look, if you don't give an opinion that matches what the society wants, they have other sources to go to. You have to understand that religion, in a way, is a religious market. There are suppliers and there are buyers. The buyers are the ordinary Muslims not trained in fiqh, in giving fatwas. They're the buyers. And the sellers are the different scholars, in a way. Now, within these different scholars, you have those who are totally trained in traditional, not even traditional, but in classical fiqh. Then you have those who have studied at university. Then you have those who are a combination of both university, secular university, and traditionally trained. And so there is, at the end, a recognition that if you don't provide a fatwa that the community wants, they will just move to another scholar. And naturally, then, let's be honest, there's also an economic factor involved in that. So what I'm trying to say is that you might have some people saying, let's support such and such party. But then, even if they're saying that, what would be interesting from a sociological perspective is to look at how many people are supporting that. The reality is, and this is the latest Pew survey, in 2017, so I'm giving you approximations. And part of my research was looking at American Muslims' attitudes towards same-sex relationship. In 2007, not even 30% of American Muslims took this view. The question was asked, should society support same-sex relationship or should society discourage same-sex relationship? Less than 30% did that in 2007. This is Pew data. Again, this is not, it's a second data that is that does not hold to any opinion. It's a non-profit organization. Guess what? In 2017, more than 50%, 53% perhaps, more than 50% of American Muslims say that society should support same-sex relationship. And also the reality is that LGBT community has supported the Muslim minority. That is the Muslim minorities in North America. Which one of the scholars who initially trained in a madrasa and then has got an education from an Ivy League, from university in North America, they all have also acknowledged that. Now, what happens that this recognition, again, you can see the social dynamic, the socio-economic experiences is leading to Muslims to develop different interpretations. So if you look at American Muslims on the issue of regarding this question, that if you look at it, you have three different interpretations. Those who hold that it's not allowed, but then you have majority who are saying it's allowed. That they, by allowed, it means that society should support. Within the Islamic discourse, you are having two different perspectives. One can be argued the neo-traditionalist approach, and one is that can be termed as progressive approach. The neo-traditionalists say that we live in a secular society. We should support other minorities as well, but religiously speaking, this is not allowed. The progressives say this is also allowed through religious justifications. So as a sociologist, this is what I was able to decipher and understand in the American Muslim community. But we also need to recognize that when it came to the rights of Muslims in North America, the LGBTQ community has been very supportive, has been an ally of the Muslim community. And that in turn has also made Muslims in North America to reflect upon that aspect. So coming back to this, we have to recognize that the clerics are not the spokespeople of Islam or the Muslim community. This is a mistake that at times we tend to do.
SubhanAllah. But then, Doc, then the question becomes, so where does the lay Muslim person get their religion from, if not from the clerics? Are they doing any sort of reading on their own then?
Right. So there are multiple ways that an ordinary Muslim, and by ordinary I mean those who are not actually trained or classically trained in Islamic literature or Islamic tradition, either they're reading books, and that's part of secularization and globalization that has transpired, is that it has led to dissemination of knowledge. I have this good book. It's an interesting book, Sharia Compliant, A User's Guide to Hacking Islamic Law, written by Dr. Rumi Ahmed. And they explain, you have to understand, if someone says that, oh, you need to know Arabic, as far as I understood about the book, they say that, look, you have enough literature in English. In fact, English has become like in a Muslim language, because you'll find a lot of work, you'll find a lot of literature that even perhaps the previous scholars did not have access to. We know, for example, that for quite some time before Shah Waliullah came and the promotion of hadith was being done in the subcontinent, many Muslim scholars did not have the Sahih Sitta. Today we have the Sahih Sitta, we have the translation of Sahih Sitta, we have its commentaries, right? So there's so much available that one can study these texts, and people do that, number one. You have tafsir in English. So for example, the study Quran that used 40 tafsir, other commentaries of the Quran. So you have that. So what is happening is either people are studying on their own, or they have these communities like Facebook. So on Facebook, they're gaining knowledge, or they listen to someone they feel matches with what I want. So it's not surprising to find that, we still have in Indian subcontinent, for example, there's this idea of trying to prove Islam through science. So you have people listening to a certain preacher who would quote science, who would quote Islamic sources in such a way to justify that it is the truth based on scientific research. But this type of thinking is not present in North American Muslims, among North American Muslims. They're more interested in civic issues. They're more interested in societal issues. So they're going to then read literature of other Muslim scholars. So this is one way: reading books, reading fatawas. And when you read fatwa of different websites, clearly you can find different interpretations easily. You can find interpretation that someone who's graduated from Al-Azhar would be different than someone who's graduated from a, let's say a Medina University, and someone who's graduated from a Deoband seminary. So that's one way. And then listening to talks. So at the end, what happens is that we need to recognize that this approach of top to bottom in the past, that the Muslim cleric, whatever they said, perhaps that is how the Muslim community would embrace or abide by, that has changed. It has evolved. It is now the Muslim individual, the Muslim an ordinary Muslim who studies, who reads because of the spread of knowledge, the availability, access of knowledge, and then is able to ask the Mufti to give me a position that fits their lived experiences.
MashaAllah. Wow, that's very profound, Doc. So now centering back to your thesis and everything, so what was your objective, if I might ask, in actually writing a thesis of this magnitude, and particularly in analyzing the data that you did analyze? What did you want to sort of create as a trajectory? And based on your findings, what do you reckon is the trajectory set? What do you reckon is the future of Muslims, let's say, for example, in the next decade or two to come, if your data can even give us some sort of indication as to how that's going?
Right. So first of all, the reason I did was that unfortunately we have apologists within the Muslim community, and then you have the anti-Muslim critics. From the anti-Muslim critics, you have this idea that Islam is an evil religion, and Islam is to be blamed for everything. And then you have the apologist who say no, Islam is religion of peace and everything. Both groups are committing fallacy of essentialism, that they're thinking that Islam is either X or Y. Islam is what people understand it to be. So, for example, you have people who wrote that according to Muslims, non-Muslims will, suffer eternal damnation. I don't like to quote people through talks, but I mentioned their names in my thesis. So you have such people who blame any event. For example, when a terrorist attack is committed by someone who has a Muslim background, immediately they connect it with Islam. Then you have those who say, no, this is not the case of Islam. It's the misinterpretation of Islam. These critics, what they fail to recognize, both of them, is that Islam is understood as people. Number one, Islam is understood as people understand it to be. That's the first thing. But then the critics of Islam, they say that, look, we had enough of this type of literature whereby, some liberal Muslim cleric is talking like this, and no, that's not the case. And, both can give their own citations. So we need to see what is the ground reality. As far as I know, not much work had been done regarding the data approach taken to understand Muslims' religious and intergroup attitudes. Much of the literature on salvation takes a theoretical, philosophical, or religious approach. It does not take a sociological approach. Much of the literature on from the Muslim perspective, in the Muslim discourse, that is regarding LGBTQ plus, what is happening is that from the Muslim, in the Muslim society, the discussion tends to be from a theological discussion, and clearly you can see that among these Muslim influencers who are using YouTube all the time, they're quoting texts and all that. I was interested to look at how social economic experiences can or has an impact or has a relationship with Muslims' religious and intergroup attitudes. So this way I am showing to both those critics of Islam or Muslims and the apologists that to understand what is happening in the Muslim community, perhaps the best way is not to go into the text, that is the Islamic source, and say, oh, this is the interpretation, but to understand how that interpretation is being contextualized. Mm-hmm. So now what happens is that I've done the quantitative part. Now I've clearly shown that the friendship leads to an inclusive interpretation regarding salvation. But then the next step, which my research needs to look at, and that's what I intend to do, is that within this issue of inclusive salvation, you have two interpretations, the strong and the weak interpretation. What do I mean by that? The weak interpretation says, because God is all merciful, and today people, that is non-Muslims, do not know about proper Islam because, the media takes a biased approach. So God, out of his mercy, will grant them mercy. Not because they're following the true religion, because Islam is the only true religion, but because they did not understand true Islam. And you can see that actually people quote Imam Ghazali for this now. This question was asked to a scholar in North America, and this is what he stated, that Imam Ghazali has said such and such in his book regarding non-Muslims of his time, that he said that they would attain salvation because they did not get the true message of Islam. That's one way. But then you have the other interpretation, which those who advocate or espouse perennialism take, which is that all religions are valid. That is, religions are like that one can take as the religions. The example they give is that, a metaphor they give is that, suppose you want to climb the top of the mountain, to reach the apex, the summit of the mountain. You can take any direction, any path to reach the mountain. When you reach the apex, whether you took the left, whether you came from the west side, east side, north side, any side, but once you reach the apex, all you see is the same reality. So religions are like that. Different paths taken to reach the same truth. So then the next step comes is that through discourses, through interviews, through interviews with Muslim respondents, and through also content analysis of these YouTube channels, one then discerns, one then finds out, okay, what form of inclusive salvific interpretation are American Muslims embracing? Is it the weak interpretation, the Ghazali one, or is it the strong version? So weak version or the strong version that says that all religions are acceptable? Because the weak interpretation, those who may expose for that, they would say that God forgives all sins, as an example. So this is then what is required to look at. This is the reason I took this research. I took this approach to understand as to what is the ground reality of Muslim. And clearly it negates both the apologists and the critics, the Islamophobes and the apologists. Now the next step comes is that we need to recognize that if people want that, some people might question, some people might assume it's because of Islam Muslims are not integrating. No, if you want more tolerant interpretations in the Muslim community to spread, then it also requires that their socio-economic conditions are improved. Because my research shows, based on theories, clearly it shows that those Muslims who are more socio-economically established, they're more likely to hold more open, tolerant views. What is interesting is that, and this is perhaps another thing that future research I'll be looking at, is that if you look at European Muslims, for example, perhaps some countries that have a significant Muslim population, the opinions held by Muslim may be less inclusive as American Muslim, but then you can clearly see these economic gulf between North American Muslims and European Muslims. So it's not surprising that North American Muslims tend to be more inclusive in their interpretation as compared to, perhaps, again, I'm not generalizing, I'm just saying that certain segments of European Muslims. Because if you see their socioeconomic experiences, they have been discriminated. They are not given economic opportunities. Whereas if you see North America, generally Muslims are given that. And my research clearly suggests then that if you want Muslims to integrate, in order for Muslims to have a sense of belonging to their host countries, it necessitates that they are given socio-economic opportunities. But then it also questions, and this would be question for the more conservative voices in the Muslim community, the idea that we should have our own religious schools. Because if you have your own religious schools, whereby only Muslim students are interacting with Muslim students, then later on, they're not going to be able to be sensitive to other cultures. So the idea of just having religious schools, whereby there's only Muslims, may not lead to a form of interpretation that is conducive and more open or more inclusive towards others. And if there has to be established, then it should be ensured that Muslim students are able to interact with non-Muslims. This can be done through school trips. So Muslim students going to going to schools of other faiths, or that there are these interfaith dialogues held, whereby Muslim students are able to meet with non-Muslim students.
This is all very profound, Doc. So I'd like to take you on a sort of journey, because when you mention the socio-economic condition of Muslims, what comes to mind is, because I'm looking at this as a citizen of Botswana and my interactions with my Muslim community and those in South Africa. So we'll start with South Africa, because perhaps that is a bit of an easier example to start with. If you look at, maybe you haven't studied the Muslim community of South Africa, but I'll give you a little bit of a summary. So the Muslim community of South Africa, many of them of Indian descent, and I mean like India, like the country as we know it today, and not the subcontinent, particularly Gujarat and those regions. Many of them today, you'll find that, mashallah, socio-economically, they are very affluent. And we're talking about the people who drive perhaps the biggest cars, your Mercedes Benzes and all those kinds of things. They've got the biggest businesses in South Africa and so on and so forth. At the same time, these are the same people who are pushing for the more, shall we say, conservative interpretations of religion. So they are, Mufti Abu Layth put it in a very funny but very brilliant way, that these people are more Deobandi than Deoband itself. And you wonder, how the hell did that happen? But that is how it actually manifests. And Botswana, to put it bluntly, is chasing their tail And I'm not sure exactly why. There's this perceived notion that, people from South Africa are very pious, so we must follow the pious people, the pious Muslims, if we want to be successful. So I'd like to ask you, how does the socio-economic condition factor in then? Is it this, that, you see, many of these people, okay, some came in the last decade or in the 80s or whatever, but a good chunk of South African Indian Muslims actually came to South Africa as slaves. And then South Africa went through its own period of apartheid, where Indians would be in their own area, blacks in their own area, white people obviously in the best of areas, and we know how that system was. So South Africa is still not completely, at least the Muslims have not completely recovered from that era of apartheid, that they still are following that sort of trajectory. Is that what it is? Because you mentioned Muslim schools, and yeah, that phenomenon definitely does exist in South Africa. In Botswana, not so much. And whether you take the approach of, the Muslims establishing madaris, like your Darul Ulooms, to actually make people learn Islam, or your actual Islamic schools where secular subjects are taught, just, maybe a segregated environment with boys on one side and girls on the other side, whatever. I've seen that this breeds a new type of mentality, a new type of culture. For example, many of my friends who are Muslim, they'll have no problem listening to music, for example, taking the liberal approach and saying there's nothing wrong with music, there's nothing wrong with smoking. But then if I go and marry a woman who is not of Asian descent like myself, then I'll get, not cancelled, but I'll get looked down upon because I didn't do something that is according to Muslim culture. I know that's a lot to unpack, but I'd like to have your thoughts on this.
So we need to understand regarding South African Muslims that there is a historical factor that needs to be taken into consideration, the influence of Deobandism. That's one thing. Then you have unfortunately, these seminaries that are very conservative. I mean, if I may say, even some are quite extreme in their interpretation of Islam. Yet what is interesting that many of them, not many of them, but some of them, when it comes to such issues about Islamic banking, they do permit that. And then the question does come, why is that? And maybe we can discuss about that later. There's always the economic part that is involved, because we know that when these Islamic banks need advisors, they're going to require muftis. So then the question comes: is it because they're giving fatwa now because they're getting economic benefits? So, but that's another topic, right? We can discover it later. But the point again, coming to South America, so there's a historical factor. Another thing is that, as you mentioned, each group is within their own, each member is within their own group. So as I said in the beginning, it's not just economic benefits or economic stability. That is coupled with friendship with outgroup members, friendship with members of other groups. If one doesn't have that, then one will not hold to more open views or inclusive interpretations. So even if we have, and here's the issue that a lot of times we don't recognize, that we have a number of, like in Pakistan, Muslim schools that, by Muslim school, I mean that like they have this O-level system they're following. At the same time, they have these 2 or 3 Islamic classes or whatever courses they have, but it doesn't lead to inclusive interpretations. Because what is happening is that, the students are not being allowed to contextualize the text, and this is what the seminaries do. They don't allow you to contextualize the text in relation to modern situation. And constantly there's this idea that one should only have in-group members as friends. So that's another important component. I wouldn't be surprised that a lot of these people who tend to be religious and they have their businesses and they're well off, yet they hold more traditional views because they themselves are not interacting at a personal level, not at a business level, but at a personal level with people of other faith or no faith. That, when it happens, that has an effect. Does that help answer your question?
It actually does, and I can vouch for that. In fact, I have in the past interacted with certain Muslim groups, and perhaps I didn't phrase what I was saying as eloquently as you, but I was a young, brash kid back then, so I was openly stating that, no, you guys are basically racist. That is the word I used, because you don't, open up your doors, so to speak, to people of other racial backgrounds, regardless of how Muslim they may be. And, I guess that was one way of saying it, but the way you've just explained the whole thing, I guess that is what I was trying to say, that yeah, you guys do business with them, you don't openly call them derogatory terms, but as far as, personally interacting with these people, and in Botswana, surprisingly enough, speaking the language, I speak Setswana, alhamdulillah, the national language of Botswana, in addition to English. A lot of these people who've been here for longer than I've been alive don't even bother to speak the language of Setswana to interact with the native indigenous people of Botswana for ridiculous reasons. We won't even necessarily have to get into that. But yeah, thanks a lot, Doc, because that definitely answers the question.
One aspect you spoke about language fluency. Here's the thing, and there's another work that I'm working, there's another research that I'm doing, looking at sense of belonging that European Muslims have for their host countries. Those who are more fluent in their home country's language they have a more sense of belonging. So when you have people who have not learned the national language of a given country, and even if they're economically settled, so how can then they interact with host countries' members? They don't need to interact then, because they're like, oh, we're settled, we're in our community. So that is why also then it is important that Muslims, wherever they're living, it would be recommended if they also learn the language of that country. At times, someone might have, in fact, and think about it, in the past, many of the Indian subcontinent clerics during the colonization time, colonial period, there were some clerics who said that one should not study English language.
Yeah, I've heard that before.
What has been the outcome? Clearly, there has been a gap between Muslims in India in terms of acquiring education compared to other groups in India, because the start that the Muslims took didn't exist. The start they took was much later. So what I was saying is that because Muslims had a late start to acquiring education, perhaps that is the reason also that there has been economic difficulties and challenges that perhaps Muslims in the Indian subcontinent are facing. Why? Because of such, sorry to say, but unhealthy opinions, disappointing verdicts that were given in the past, because they're in question. The fear was that if you would learn English language, then it is possible that one may leave Islamic practices. Well, that has not been the case, because in fact English has become, as I said, like Muslim scholars, they say it has become a Muslim language. By that it means that Muslims communicate in English. Most of us don't know Arabic, but we do know English. Look at this, we're communicating in English regarding Muslim community, right? But that's the problem of giving such harmful fatwas. The effect are later on. Look at the issue of TV. If you look at the issue of TV, I remember that TV would be haram, but what now I find it fascinating is that the same clerics who would say that TV and all that is haram, they come on TV themselves. They have their YouTube channels, they have these pictures on their websites, so then for an ordinary Muslim, they might say, isn't this hypocrisy? And so that's another thing that, later on we can talk about. But the point coming back is that if you do not encourage language to be learned by the Muslim, they're not going to integrate. So learning languages, I feel it's a good thing, number one. It should be emphasized in the Muslim community, number two. And you have to have these personal contacts. It's only through personal contact that these views would then be questioned. So, yeah, I mean, South African Muslims, again, I wouldn't be surprised that they do not have personal interaction, like friendship with people of other communities.
Yeah, that makes sense. But wouldn't the retort be, Doc, that when, and we're not necessarily talking about South Africa now, but when a community or a group of people who happen to be from the same community move to a new country, a new land altogether, that they will just kind of stick to those people whom they feel most comfortable or most familiar with? And you're from Canada, I'm sure you must see elements of this happening. So, for example, the Somalian community in Canada, in maybe one neighborhood over there, it's not because they are racist and they hate the rest of us Muslims who are not Somalians. It's just that many of these people, perhaps they didn't speak English, so if they needed something, it wouldn't be as effective for them to go to someone and explain to them what they need in English. So they would just go, and if they're in the Somalian community, they can just speak in Somali and get their job done. And then they'd have the Somali masjid where they give the lectures in Somali and so on and so forth. So at least at the beginning stage, that is what people would present as a sort of defense that, no, we were just sticking together because we were just sticking to what we were familiar with. And if we didn't stick to that, then we would be completely lost. The problem comes in the subsequent generations because they probably speak English better than Somali or any other language for that matter. And now you've got an identity crisis formulating in this child or this teenager that many of them end up leaving Islam because they think that, no, Islam is my home culture, whatever you call it, my Somali culture, my Pakistani culture, whatever it is, which is simply not the case. And then they're like, so I can't reconcile my Canadian identity with my Muslim identity, so let me just leave Islam because I'm still going to live in Canada. So yeah, I guess that is the defense that's presented. But what's your take on it, Doc?
Yeah. So first of all, we need to recognize that when we're talking about Muslims and if they're coming to a country, that's why it's also important for the countries, the social institution of those countries to provide opportunities. Like one of the good things of the Canadian government has done is that it provides opportunities for new arrivals, for immigrants to become aware of the society. So I still remember that when my wife, she came to Canada, there was this these agencies who aid and guide immigrants. They came with vouchers and started explaining, okay, these are other groups and all that stuff. My point is that look at this, that the Canadian government is taking a very good move strategically speaking. By strategically, I mean ensuring that integration can happen even at the first generation. Because what is happening is that they're providing them opportunities. So immigrants, when they come here, they're being provided employment training, networking, and all that. And so this is the right direction. Like I mentioned, in terms of that, the Muslims, in order to Muslims to have this sense of belonging, I'm talking about Muslim minorities, migrant Muslims. It is necessary also that the social institutions provide them the opportunities, the spaces for such stability to transpire. That is, interaction with others and economic benefit, and that economic stability can be achieved. So, taking the example of Canadian government, for example, this is or other governments that are doing that. This is not Canadian government, but other European countries that do that. They provide these opportunities for immigrants. Like I told you, when my wife came here, I sponsor her, and there was this person, two people who came, and they provided her they were explaining to her all these opportunities that she can avail. Now, what happens that this initial positive experience, in turn, creates a long-lasting impact on the person, thinking that, look, I just came here, it's only been a few months, and here's the country that is looking after me, that is trying to ensure that I can successfully, that I can achieve success, even though I've just recently arrived in this country, as an example. So that is needed. Now, another thing that on the part of, in this case, we're talking about Muslims, the case of Muslim minority, it is necessary that they ensure that their children are not being taught a version of religious interpretation that was part of their country. That is problematic, which many parents do. And at the same time, children should be allowed to think and to ask questions. So, for example, my son, he asked me a question. This was about, so he was about like 6 or 7 years old, and he was trying to explain in his own way the issue of theodicy regarding why does evil happen in the world. So he said in the following way: why does God allow a shark to eat a human being? The point is, these types of questions should be encouraged, that let the children ask the types of questions they want. And so, as a parent, I'm not going to try to delimit their thinking. I also feel that it is necessary, it would be quite healthy for Muslim children not to just see their mosque, not to just experience what is happening in the mosque, but that parents should also take their children to different religious places, to synagogues, church, temples, so they see the diversity within it. It is now what happens that when they see this diversity, then the question can come, okay, they can ask, what is the truth? And that's where Ibn Arabi's perspective, or this more inclusive interpretation can come, that, the divine says, the God says in the Quran, those who believe, Jews, Christians, Sabians, whosoever believes in God and the day of judgment, there shall be no fear upon them. So you can give this type of interpretation to explain Muslims second generation as to Islam is not just saying that, oh, this interpretation is right. It acknowledges diversity. And to be honest, historically, Islam has always embraced diversity. Think about it. The Quran can be recited in multiple ways. So, for example, you can recite in Surah Fatiha, alayhim, alayhum. You can say, wadduha, wadduhe, right? So these are different ways. Why? Because they were different tribes. And they pronounce certain words differently. So someone can argue, and God himself says that he intends ease for you. So if God revealed the Quran in multiple ways, just because people, one of the reasons, just because people had different ways of pronunciation, wouldn't he make his religion easy? And wouldn't he allow his religion to have diverse views? We can see that in prayers, for example. It was easy for the Prophet of Islam to explain just one way, but clearly we see different ways. Abdullah bin Masud had a different way. You think about the leaving of the hand. Some people think you cannot do sadal. Sadal is like how the Malikis pray. Yeah. That is also known as irsal. And some Sunnis, they say, oh, it's the Shia practice. No, this is how Abdullah ibn Zubair, who was the first child born after Hijrah in the Muslim community, first boy born in the Muslim community after Hijrah, he used to unfold his hands. He used to leave his hands on the side. Now his maternal grandfather was Abu Bakr Siddiq, the first caliph, and his father was Zubair, who's among the Asham Mubashar, both the grandfather and the father Asham Mubashar. Leaving hands, if this was wrong, don't you think they would have said that this is not allowed?
Absolutely.
So what happens that we need to embrace those opinions that recognizes and that embraces diversity. And this is what is happening. Because if you do not do that, then as you mentioned, that some people, then they are saying, oh, this is what Islam says, but this is clearly, it's problematic. And indeed it is problematic then.
Absolutely. But then, Doc, wouldn't the question be then, or at least wouldn't the kids raise the question, what's the point of being Muslim then? If God is going to accept all of us, whether we're Muslim, Christian, Hindu, atheist, well, then what's the point of remaining Muslim and having all these restrictions of, for example, eating halal and not eating bacon? Why don't I just become a Christian, go to church on Sunday and chow down on that hamburger from that haram joint down the road or something like that? What do you do when such a question is posed? Now, how do you go about explaining that to a child?
So first, and now, if you would ask me this approach, how I would take, and so I'm talking from an Akbarian perspective, I recognize that all paths lead to the summit, the apex. Whichever path one takes, one can reach the apex. From the Muslim perspective, one can say that the easiest path is Islam. But then again, it depends on the type the person is as a climber. For some people, it may be a different path. Now, once we recognize that, then it is possible for the child, in my case, my son, to recognize that there are different ways, and he was born in a Muslim family. It doesn't mean he cannot explore other faiths. But what it will make him grounded is that he will recognize that there's only one reality. And the way is that instead, when you're saying, okay, he can eat a hamburger, now that is more focused on the issue of achieving desires. But this approach is saying, try to actualize the truth. There's a difference between actualizing the truth and following one's desire. It is possible for someone to say that I find that other religion is more truthful. Fine. But then they're trying to seek the truth. And God decides a case, or you can say God's judgment is based on one's intention. The idea is not to say that, the idea is not to just convince a person saying my interpretation is right. The idea behind should be that try to find the truth. The truth is everywhere, but there are gradations, there are degrees of truth. try to acquire the highest level of truth.
Wow.
And if you look at that, all religions, at the end, they show the same thing. If you read Bhagavad Gita, for example, Krishna Arjun, there's a very wonderful line. It says, Krishna says, all paths lead to me. So when when a father is saying that, look, he says from Islamic perspective, it doesn't matter which faith you are in, you will achieve salvation. And then the child, later on, when they become an adult, they read Bhagavad Gita, it would remind them, this is what my father said. So that is what we need to recognize, is that this is the problem at times. Also, part of, the question you have asked, and for many of perhaps the Muslim community, the issue becomes about religious identity, or religious as a political identity. Islam is more than that. Islam is trying to say, do an inward journey, because as there is a narration in Islam, by narration I mean there is a saying that number of saints and scholars use, is that one who knows himself knows the Lord. So that issue of going other path, no, if you recognize there is this, the path will be the truth. Now, of course, the other paths that can lead to either lead to damnation, and by damnation it means that it can lead to something that is not paradise. So there are two paths. At the end of the day, both paths lead to the divine. But the type of interaction you want to have with the divine, these paths will have that effect on you, right? That's how the Akbarian perspective is. But interesting, he says also at the end, everything ends with mercy. So even those, for example, and that's a lot of people would say, oh, what if someone leaves Islam? They would suffer eternal damnation. No, they wouldn't suffer. How is it possible? This is the Akbarian perspective, or you can say the more philosophical perspective. How is it possible? And here's the analogy, is as a given. The companions were asked that if this child can be saved from fire, would the mother not try to save her child? And the companions agreed to that, if she has the capability. So then the companions were told that God is more merciful than this mother. How is it possible for God, who is all merciful, to make his creation suffer eternally? And so Ibn Arabi says that's not the case. Ibn Arabi says that at the end, both those who are in paradise and those who are in hellfire will attain salvation. By salvation, I mean they'll attain mercy. They'll attain mercy. It is like, now someone would say, oh no, what about the punishment? No, the punishment there would be in such a, the punishment wouldn't be there. What is happening is that, not the punishment will be there, but what I understood what Ibn Arabi was saying is that you have to recognize that their environment becomes part of their they're comfortable living in that habitat now. They're comfortable, their residence matches with their condition. So for example, when an individual who lives in desert, they can embrace the heat warm. A person like myself, perhaps not anymore. But those same people who are living in the desert, if they come to a cold place, they would struggle. So God, out of his mercy, makes the hellfire in such a way that it accommodates, it gives them comfort. It doesn't deny that people wouldn't be there in forever. They would be there in forever. But instead of torment, they're attaining bliss. They have attained mercy.
In other words, they kind of adapt to the environment of hell, if you look at it that way. And it's interesting because doesn't the word in Arabic, adab, which we traditionally translate as punishment, but I think I heard or read somewhere that it comes from the root word uduba, which actually means like sweet or something. It means something pleasant.
Yes, that's a good point. Ibn Arabi does mention that. He says, isn't it it's not a coincidence that God has used the word azab. He could have used other words. Why this? Because one of the meanings of this is sweet. Water that is sweet, that can be drunk, right? So based on that, that's why he says at the end it will be mercy that will prevail. So this torment would become bliss. It would sweeten in the way, it would become adaptable for the people, that they would find mercy in that. They would find bliss in that. Again, now one can say, oh, this is just a Muslim interpretation. Precisely, this is a Muslim interpretation. You don't have to hold to this interpretation. But one cannot say one cannot say that this one interpretation that only Muslim attain salvation, other will suffer forever, that is Islam. No, this is also Islam. Because this can also be justified from the Quran and the Sunnah. It does not negate the literal interpretation of the Quran. So now Ibn Arabi would say that, remember, God will deal with you the way you think of him. Because there is a narration, God says that he is the way his creation thinks of him. The way the people think of God, that is the way he is towards them. So if a person believes that God is merciful, that is how God would treat him. There's a story there's a story regarding a person who would only speak about the mercy of God in his khutbahs. Now this is given as a story. Now it doesn't mean it's true, but there's always a meaning behind these stories to explain. The person was asked, he used to in his khutbahs always speak about the mercy of God. Never did he speak about the punishment or wrath of God. He passed away, this scholar. One other scholar saw him in his dream. And he asked him, what did God do to you? So the person who used to just speak about the mercy of God, he said, God has forgiven me. The person asked him, why did that happen? What was the reason behind it? So this person says, this person is saying that God asked me that, why did you only speak about my mercy? Why didn't you speak about my punishment? So the person replied, God, because I wanted people to love you. So because of this intent, he was forgiven. Because of this intent to explain that I wanted people to love you, so I just spoke about mercy.
Wow.
Especially in today's world where there's so many struggles we're having as individuals, as a community, we need to embrace mercy. In fact, mercy is the only thing that is present among all things, because God constantly says, God has said in his Quran, my mercy embraces everything or all things. Within thing also comes hell. Within thing comes also negating of Islam. Within thing comes also people outside of the Muslim community.
So beautiful and so profound, Doc. But then this brings once again, it brings a new question, although I agree 100% with everything you're saying. But this is not an invitation, is it, for someone to do whatever the hell he wants to do in life? And I'm using the word hell quite astutely, because let's say he's, for example, he's engaged in genocide, he's engaged in all these heinous crimes, that you will. But then later in life, he kind of changes, or at least when he's doing all these heinous acts, he always says that, no, Allah is merciful. So is such a person also deserving of Allah's mercy when he's clearly engaged in things which are not merciful, but because he's expectant of the mercy of Allah, is he also in this mercy of Allah?
Part of mercy is justice, and we need to understand what does mercy entail. I apologize, perhaps I should have explained further. Look, by mercy, there are two types of rights: God's rights and human rights. And I'll give you this as an example of what mercy entails. Just to first give you a human example, and then to explain, perhaps that may explain further about this mercy. So I have two children. Both are boys. If any of them say something to me, they're children. One is 9 years old, another is 3 years old. If something they say to me, or if, they are like, they won't listen to me. If I tell them, can you get this, something like, no, I don't want to get it, I'll forgive them. I know, because they're children. Or if they do something that is like, mischievous, they're being mischievous, I might scold them. And I would say, you know what, I'm not speaking to you. And then they come to me and they're like, I'm so sorry. And they're like, I promise I won't do it again. I will listen to you. And I know they will still do it again because they're children. I know that their promise will only last for 5 minutes. They'll do it again, right? They'll jump on the bed again. But what will I do? I'll forgive them because they're my children. But then, if the older son has done something to the younger son, I'm going to punish him. Why? Because that is justice, and that is showing mercy to my child, or vice versa. Unless the younger one forgives him. If he says it's okay, Bhaijan, then I won't. So I'm showing mercy. So that is what we need to recognize, that if someone has harmed a person, he is accountable. His punishment will be equal to the punishment that person deserved because of harming another. But then once that punishment is meted out, once that punishment is given, mercy prevails. So in this way, when someone doesn't pray to, let's say, his prayers, that's between God and the person. But if someone snatches the right of the person, takes the right of another person away, he's going to be held accountable, unless the person forgives him.
Sure. And obviously this is within reason. It shouldn't be, well, you gave an example with your children, but I'm assuming that it shouldn't be something petty, or, oh, you did not reply to my WhatsApp message, I'm not forgiving you. I'm surely, we shouldn't infantilize God and, say that, well, this guy will be punished because he did not respond to the WhatsApp message, when he might have had a very valid reason for not responding to the WhatsApp message, even though the other person took it to heart. But yeah, what's your take on that, Doc?
Yeah, so what happens is that when a person takes the path of mercy, they try to give benefit of doubt.
Yes, absolutely.
Husnul Zan, they're always having good opinions about other, because they don't see anything bad. Why? Because they're going to remember this Quranic verse, Allazi ahsana kulla shay'in khalaqa, that whatever God has made beautiful all things. So he's going to always have good opinion, and yet he's also going to recognize, because I'm nothing, I'm always making mistakes. So they will try to rectify themselves. That's individual. They're going to try to rectify themselves, try to improve themselves. Let me give you another example with mercy. Like, you have to understand, like Hajjaj bin Yusuf. Hajjaj bin Yusuf, based on historical documents, he massacred a lot of Muslims. He killed a lot of Muslims. Muslims suffered a lot under him, right?
Yeah.
So I think the last person he had killed was Syed ibn Jubair or ibn Musayyib. I think it was ibn Jubair. I might be mistaken. So he had prayed. He was a saint. He said that, that God, let me be the last person who comes under the tyranny of Hajjaj. So anyway, Hajjaj passes away, and then someone asked him, what happened to you? So this is what he said. He said, for each person I have killed, I have experienced one death. Except for Saeed, it was 70. My point is that, for me, this perhaps makes me understand that, look, because Hajjaj had killed innocent people, Hajjaj was a tyrant, his experience or his punishment was equal to what he did. So if he killed whatever number of people, that is the punishment he received. And that is that God has shown mercy to those under whom God has shown mercy to those who had experienced tyranny of Hajjaj bin Yusuf. So we need to differentiate. We need to understand. That's why it's so important. Like, look, if a person doesn't pray, that's between God and him, and God forgives. But if it's someone, he has taken the right of someone else, that's where you have to then be really, really careful, because there is a punishment there. And that's how the Muslim scholars would say. Again, if you would ask me from a sociological perspective, I would simply say that this is, look, how Muslims are engaging with these topics.
MashaAllah. Very, very beautifully and very well rounded in your explanation of things, Doc. Do you ever think twice about the things that you say? Because you literally can shake the foundations of faith for many people with all the statements that you say. So depending on the context, do you ever think, like, maybe I shouldn't say this right here and right now?
There's a narration by Ali alayhi salam. Now think about how even the words we are using. The moment I say alayhi salam, some people would assume that he belonged to the Shia school of thought. What is interesting is that many Sunnis have used alayhi salam before as well. Not that I'm saying I'm Sunni, but I'm just giving an example how words affect our reality.
Yeah.
So how maybe someone is listening, they wouldn't know that I study with Sunni scholars, so they would then say, oh, he's a Shia, so they would meet with me differently. That's why I'm trying to say that we need to see how even the words has an effect on the society.
Absolutely.
Regarding this here, so Imam Ali has said that speak to the people according to their level of understanding. We wouldn't like. What he was saying that would you like that people start to disbelieve God and His messenger? Now here's the challenge that today we are facing. Usually, a lot of discussion of people like Ibn Arabi, this wasn't discussed publicly. But the question now is that with the spread of knowledge and knowledge being accessible, and so many critics of Islam, and so many conservative voices within the Muslim community, and so much misinformation at times, perhaps such things have to be discussed about. Would it lead to problem? Clearly, because then what happens that, one thing I forgot to mention is that many times those who are economically settled and yet they still hold conservative views, like you mentioned about South African Muslims, what happens that if you meet people from other communities, your preconceived beliefs are being questioned. For many, that is problematic. Imagine how your whole worldview is being turned upside down. But then that's where now I'm going to shift a bit of gear and say that that's where Ibn Arabi comes into play. You have to understand that Ibn Arabi says that all of us are worshipping. Our beliefs are like idols. All of us are believing in certain forms of idol beliefs. So the idea behind that statement is that we need to recognize that everything one is experiencing is the truth. But there are different intensity of that truth. And in this way, one can reconcile by seeing all these differences as manifestation of the divine. And yet recognize that some of it is closer to the divine than not. Why? Because the Quran clearly says, فَأَيْنَمَا تُوَلُّوا فَثَمَّ وَجْهُ اللَّهِ Surah Baqarah, which is number 2, verse 115. Wheresoever you turn, there is the face of God. Now the word tuwallu doesn't just mean turn as in physical. It can also mean different thoughts that are coming, right? Internal thoughts that are continuously shaping. So now what happens is that the premise has been made that everything is a manifestation of the divine. But then there's a hadith which says that give to each thing that has a haqq its haqq. So the haqq is reality, and we know haqq belongs to only the divine, because God Himself says that He is the truth. So what it means is that treat each thing according to the level, according to the intensity, the degree of truth it is being given to. So in other words, the way of interacting with someone who mocks Islam is not through violence. It's not through cursing at him. It's through that Quranic verse which says, there's so many Quranic verses which states about good conduct. That is its haqq. You speak to such people in a way that shows how the Prophet would express mercy. Why would his enemies embrace him as a prophet later on? Because of his conduct. So that is why we need to understand this approach, that what we see, everything is a reflection, a manifestation of the divine, but each has a certain limitation or certain disclosure of the divine. So it is limited in that sense. And then we need to give its haqq to the extent it has haqq.
MashaAllah. Beautifully put. So beautiful, MashaAllah. Just since we've been talking a lot about Ibn Arabi, we'll come to him. But just to backtrack a little bit, when it comes to conservative positions, Doc, in Islam particularly, do you think that this has got anything to do with the quote-unquote virtue of disobedience? That it's always somewhat fashionable or in vogue to think differently from everyone else? So when we talk about, for example, Muslims who are anti-feminists, or at least feminism how it's being portrayed to be in today's time, and it's not just in the Islamic circle. You've got the rise of many conservative commentators, if you will, from the Western world who speak up for things like masculinity, that men should be men and women should be women, of course, but particularly coming from this angle because they want to uplift men and take them away from this demasculinization or whatever they want to call it. Is this something to do with the fact that as we're progressing in society, it's becoming more mainstream to say that, no, of course, we should respect our women and we should give them high positions of honor. And of course, we treat people with respect, even if they have, sexual tendencies to the same gender or whatever it is this a fact that as that becomes more like commonplace, then the dissenting voice also somewhat gets louder, and the dissenting voice now comes in the fact that no, there are only two genders. No, women should know their place, and that's not where men are, and so on and so forth.
So the dissenting voice comes because the status quo is changing. If we have Islamic feminism, and think about it, a lot of interpretation in classical Islamic tradition clearly expresses patriarchal interpretation, misogynistic, androcentric, and by androcentric means male-oriented, and these are problematic. Now, because of more education for both women and men, there is resistance to these interpretations, and rightly so. Why is it, for example, that it is Muslim male scholars who are talking about religious issues dealing with women? It should be women who are dealing with these issues. Isn't it a coincidence? I mean, think about this. When it comes to the issue of beard, we have diverse opinions. Now think about this thing. A Muslim has migrated to a country where, unfortunately, Islamophobia is rising. Now, the Muslim husband and wife have recently migrated. Now, the Muslim man had a long beard, but he knows their difference of opinion. Some say this, the way I have kept it, it's permissible. The Malikis and Shafi would endorse that. And yet for the Muslim woman, the dominant opinion is that, oh, she has to wear a hijab. My question does come in the mind, why is it that Muslim men, their issues has more interpretation, more differences whereby they can, adapt to the environment than Muslim women? And perhaps the reason is that, unfortunately, Muslim men have found their own interpretation that is more easy for them. And therefore, it is necessary that Muslim women should have a voice, and they should be speaking about their issues. It shouldn't be Muslim men. So what is happening is that for these many in the Muslim community, I'm going to focus on that, are speaking because the status quo is changing. Their position is being lost. So they're not feeling comfortable with that. That may be one opinion, one reason. Another reason that they simply believe this is the case. But here the problem is that then they're assuming that this is the only interpretation of Islam. And yet they don't recognize that their socio-economic environment is influencing them. Why is it that a person who studies from a Medina university holds a different view than someone who has studied in a secular university? Because their way of looking at the authoritative Islamic texts are different. So this is going to happen as the societies change, as things change. But it is important for the Muslim community to recognize that it needs to embrace diversity and equality. For too many of the classical Muslim positions when it deals with women rights is concerning and problematic. So what it means is that there are reinterpretations having, and if I take the Ibn Arabi's approach, so long as they meet the Quranic text, that is the Arabic, literal understanding of Arabic words, they can be accepted. So there is no harm in that then.
So basically you are saying that there is scope. Obviously female scholars have been a thing, although not so much in the limelight, but a scope for example, female imams, which is a hotly debated topic.
Yeah. Interesting, Ibn Arabi held this view. He held this view, and there's a reason he justified it. Well, there is the narration of Waraka in Sunan Abu Dawud. Now, some people would say, oh, this is a Zaif narration. Let's leave that aside. We have scholars, Abu Thawr and Imam at-Tabari, who were of the view that a woman can lead a congregation of mixed gender without, mutlakan, that is like unconditionally. Wow. The point is that why would they do that? Because they had some text, right? They had some justification. Now, someone might say, oh, their interpretation is wrong. how can you determine the interpretation is wrong? Because you assume your interpretation is right. But your interpretation cannot be right because it's only subjective. At the end of the day, any interpretation is subjective. Right? That's one thing. And Ibn Arabi quotes that narration which says that, among the believing men and women, there were those people who had reached perfect faith, full, complete faith. And the narration quotes Maryam, alayhi salam, and Asiya, the wife of Pharaoh, right? So based on that, look, if someone has been able to reach complete iman or has perfect faith, that automatically means they were able to they were able to be imams as well. And what is the job of a leader in a congregation? To be an imam. So based on that interpretation, Ibn Arabi says that a woman can lead both men and women in prayers.
Wow.
Now, if someone does that, what is wrong in that? Dr. Hamidullah, another great scholar who lived in France, he did 2 PhDs. He explained this narration of Waraka in such a way. He said that this is narration. And by the way, Waraka, she would lead the prayers. When I say about Waraka leading prayers, she would lead prayers both. There were men and women behind her, right? She would lead, and she passed away in the time of either Omar or Uthman. I think it was Uthman. I can't remember. And yet, Omar did not stop him, radiallahu anhu. He never stopped her from praying or leading or being in the position of an imam. If it was wrong, wouldn't he stop? No, he didn't. So that's one thing. Now, how did Dr. Hamidullah contextualize it? What happened was that he mentioned that there was this Muslim woman and Muslim man who came, and they explained that the husband has recently converted to Islam, and they want to pray, but there are not many mosques around. So how should they do? Because he just converted to Islam, he cannot lead, he doesn't know prayers, how to lead prayers. So Dr. Muhammad Hamidullah, he explained that he immediately recalled this narration of Waraka and told the wife of that person that saying that you lead the prayers so long as that person has recited, until the person has learned the Surah Fatiha and other surahs. Excuse me. Once he has learned that, then he can lead. But then again, this is how Dr. Hamidullah contextualized. If someone says that a woman can unconditionally lead, okay, because you have the justifications. You have Ibn Arabi stating that, you have Imam al-Tabari, you have Abu Thawr. All these are giant scholars within Islamic literature or Islamic field. Does that mean that, that either they are wrong, okay, if they're wrong, but then that is based on your subjective understanding. And there is no guarantee your interpretation is right. So if someone wants, if this becomes an issue for someone, and they're saying that what type of religion is that a woman just has to stay at the back, or she has to stay in the basement of a mosque, unfortunately this is what is happening, and this is problematic. Then one can say, yeah, this is happening sadly, but look, there are these other interpretations of Islam. And the nature of religion is that you're going to have multiple interpretations. Now, so the reason now, if I take the philosophical approach, I would say someone would say, why are the differences? From a religious perspective, one can argue because God wants ease for you. And it clearly says in the Qur'an, He wants ease for you. So the different rulings are there because each society has their own different understanding of what is norms, what is culturally, what is acceptable. So we need to recognize that as well. Because if we think we need to recognize societies are different in their approaches to issues. And the divine has given these different rulings on different issues I'm talking about for the ease of the community. For example, the issue of eating non-zabiha. Well, in the Muslim world, you have these, but maybe in some non-Muslim countries, that is not the case. So one can then take the Maliki view, which is that it is permissible. The idea of Islam isn't just to have this list of halal and haram. The idea behind following the law is to recognize the truth, is to actualize the truth. It is like the key. The Islamic law is like the key that opens the door to something that explains to you what is the real, what is the truth. So it opens the door towards understanding what is your relationship with the divine. And your relationship with the divine is, as God has said, that he blew his spirit into Adam, or that God created Adam in his image, or that he has said that soon you will see our verses in the horizons and in themselves until they will know it is the truth. Annahul haq, the hu zamir jo hai, the zamir, can be indicated for both the humans, that is themselves, and the cosmos. So the goal is that to achieve or to actualize the truth. That is one religious interpretation that can be provided.
Wow, mashallah, that's very, very profound and beauty upon beauty, Doc. We've been speaking a lot about Ibn Arabi, rahmatullah alayh. So is there anything more you would like to share with the audience about this phenomenal scholar who put mercy in the pinnacle that it is? On a lighter note, before we get to that, on a lighter note, is the portrayal of Ibn Arabi in the TV series Ertugrul accurate, according to you?
I don't know if it's accurate, but a lot of aspects they show can correspond with how Muslim scholars have, or how Muslim tradition has expressed him as a person who had certain divine gifts. But yeah, Ibn Arabi in that drama series, it's a lot of people have been inspired by him. In fact, I feel like the Prime Minister of Imran Khan, he has been promoting such drama.
Oh yeah, he definitely has. But okay, first of all, Doc, you just openly admitted that you do watch Ertugrul, so mashallah.
No. Too long. It's too long. I can't.
Well, yeah, I can relate with it being too long. But okay, but you have familiarity with it, basically. I'm sure you've seen clips of Ibn Arabi in particular, if you are this familiar with what you're talking about. So... But yeah, okay. But then when you talk about Imran Khan making it an actual thing in Pakistan, have you noticed how this has, I don't know, triggered a new, if you call it, craze in Pakistan, that now, I don't know, so much of the population think that they are somehow Turkish or related to Ertugrul and all that. And, well, they're flooding the female actresses' Instagrams, and basically harassing them because of the way they dress. So, I don't know. I mean, in my personal opinion, I do respect Imran Khan, but that is one of the not so intelligent decisions that he's made, in my opinion.
Right. So yeah, it's very unfortunate if you see how, I think the word is trolling. Like you have these people who are trolling these actresses. Very unfortunate. And that's what the problem is, that you have to understand that unfortunately, religion has become like an ideology with an identity. And Imran Khan was trying to say that you have to understand, if you read his book about his biography, it's he mentioned his interest in Sufism. So the idea, at least one aspect of one interpretation of Islam, is not an identity that you have to carry and show it to people. It's again trying to understand who you are. What is your relationship with the cosmos? What is your relationship with the divine? The idea is to search behind the truth. The idea is to reach the level of haqqul yaqeen, from ilmul yaqeen to haqqul yaqeen. But the problem is that in the because of modernity itself, identity has become a focal point, and so religious identity is one of these. So that is why you would see that now there is this connection with the Turkish and all that. But the reality, you have to understand, Indian subcontinent was heavily influenced by Sufism and this mystical form of interpretation of Islam that was removed after during the Soviet Afghan war. Then a certain form of interpretation that came. It's and here's another thing which is interesting, is that those societies that had Qawwali being recited, where the stories of Saad, where the stories of Rumi were being told about, you would notice that even the ghazal that were written by Mirza Ghalib had like this Sufi touch or this mystical interpretation. That society also inculcated tahzeeb, etiquettes. With Qawwali and all these types of aspects going away, you see that there's more focus towards identity, more towards outward manifestation rather than inward realization.
Absolutely. But wouldn't you describe that as sort of a worldwide phenomenon with Muslims, not just the Indian subcontinent, that there is this idea that we have to speak and look a certain way, particularly when it comes to identity.
Yes, because this is happening because with in the modern times, and this is the reason is that with modernity came rationalism, empiricism, and all these positive approach that was taken. So now what happens is that the Muslim world was colonized. Many of these scholars stood up and they wanted to they wanted to ensure that Muslims attained their freedom. They felt all this Sufism or all these mystical interpretations are harming Muslims to progress, to scientifically progress. So the reason that we're having these interpretations is because, not just because it's subcontinent, it's because there has been a loss of Muslim philosophy. Because the idea, when, in the past people would study Muslim philosophy. Now if you go and study in Dars-e-Nizami, the focus are on transmitted sciences, not on intellectual sciences. So that component has been lost. And it's through these intellectual sciences that etiquettes and norms and the issues of how to conduct oneself was heavily influenced by. That is missing. So the reason was that colonization led to an idea that we need to take a more positivist approach. The positive approach recognizes transmitted knowledge but does not recognize intellectual knowledge. Thus you have so much focus on jurisprudence and hadith.
Wow, mashallah. But this has been an interesting and very, very information-packed conversation, Doc. For the listeners and the viewers, if someone wants to read more about Ibn Arabi, and even your thesis for that matter, but let's start with Ibn Arabi. If I want to read more about Ibn Arabi, what are some texts that you recommend? Possibly in English, but if there's something in Arabic that's been translated, let us know as well.
Right. So the one book, there are 3 books, but the first one I would recommend to read is Ibn Arabi, Heir to the Prophets by Dr. William Shiddick. Dr. William Shiddick is an expert. There are very few experts on Ibn Arabi, and Dr. William Shiddick is certainly an expert on Ibn Arabi. Read that book first. That is the starting book. After that, the next book that one can read is the Sufi Path of Knowledge, again written by Dr. William Shiddick. Once that has been reached, and sometimes people say, okay, I can't, someone told me that I've read this book in, not that person said, but we're just mentioning that they're almost ending this book after 2 weeks. Believe me, this book that I mentioned, the self-disclosure, it took me 8 months to read the book, and I still feel I haven't learned much. Then the third book is the self-disclosure of God. Another really good book is written by Eric Winkle. He's the second scholar who has worked on Ibn Arabi. In fact, he is translating Futuhatul Makkiyah from Arabic to English, which is Islam and the Living Law, the Ibn al-Arabi approach. These are really good books because they make you understand that the Islam that many times we've been just listening, there's more to it. There's more to it. It's a religion, because then you realize that for Ibn Arabi, again, he's basing his views on Quran and Sunnah. He was well versed in Quran and Sunnah. He studied under 70 scholars. By 70, I mean many number of scholars. So he was well versed in Arabic language, well versed in Quran, well versed in Hadith sciences or Hadith transmission narrations. So his views are based on Quranic texts. When he's talking about mercy, for example, well, here's the thing. Think about this. Think it this way. If we take this interpretation, wheresoever you turn, there's the face of God, and we take it the literal way, because God says the Quran, He has revealed, is in clear Arabic. So if I read this from a literal perspective, wheresoever I turn, there's the face of God. Wheresoever you turn, there's the face of God. Then if I look at anything, I'm looking at one of the faces of God. And what has God said? That He has decreed mercy upon Himself. He has used the word nafs. Kataba rabbukum ala nafsihi rahma. Though He doesn't require to. So He has decreed mercy upon Himself. And doesn't there say in the Quran that to God belongs all the beautiful names? It also says that. So if I see everything from that way, that it is a manifestation of the divine, then will I not see mercy everywhere?
Absolutely.
And when I see this way, what happens is that, remember, once you see that everything is beautiful, you're getting closer to the divine. And there's a hadith that says that when God loves a person, He becomes his hearing through which he hears, his side through which he sees. So now what is happening is that you're not seeing the world from your own ego or from your own selfish feelings. You're seeing the world for what it is.
Wow.
So this is what Ibn Arabi does. Is that based on the Quranic verses, now you're seeing the world from a different place. Now you're making, what happens is that you are showing mercy yourself.
Subhanallah. Subhanallah. Yeah, this is really out of this world, Doc. So, any parting words, especially, I was thinking about this just now, for those people in my audience who are thinking about seeking knowledge of Islam. They haven't decided whether they're going to go to Medina University or study the Dars-e-Nizami for whatever, how many years that is, or people just seeking to understand Islam in general, but they know they don't have the time. Like myself, I'd like to get to know more about Islam, but right now, shipping off to Egypt or Pakistan for like 7 or 8 years isn't really the first thing that comes to mind. So what's your advice to these sorts of people if they want to know more about Islam?
First thing, before understanding these Islamic texts, it's important to philosophize properly. What do I mean by that? Look, the reality is that if people think, like some Muslim scholars say, philosophy is haram, you have to recognize that if one doesn't philosophize, then someone else is going to do it for you. A lot of questions when we ask, like even when we're asking to others, they have certain philosophical assumptions. Well, these are hidden philosophical assumptions that the society is influencing the individual. And so that is the reason the person holds these philosophical assumptions. Now what happens is that one needs to properly have a philosophical framework, and that comes through reading books of Ibn Arabi and Mullah Sadra. Once one has done that, then they're able to read Quran in such a way that they're able to understand what it means. So for example, let me see if there's a verse I can give you. There's like if you look at the meaning of Rabbul Alameen, usually it's translated Lord of the Worlds. But if you go deeper, the word alam, it also means traces, remnants, something that is left, right? Mm-hmm. So if you understand it in this way, you recognize that the whole cosmos, because that's what Alameen is, that it means it's a stamp, but then it means someone has stamped it. It means it's a mark. So then it means there must be a marker. So now what happens is that when you're reading anything or when you're seeing everything, you know that these are part of the Alameen. So they are marks, traces of the divine. So this way, now how did that transpire? Because now the person has read Ibn Arabi, who says that, look, at the end of the day, everything is he and not he. Everything is he to the extent that it manifests as divine, but everything he is beyond everything. Because there are two verses you have to understand. Laysa kamislihi shay'un, and then at the same time, wa huwa samiul basir, or that it says, فَأَيْنَمَا تُوَلُّوا فَثَمَّ وَجْهُ اللَّهِ. But even then you have to understand the interpretations are going to be unlimited. Once you have philosophized, you have studied Ibn Arabi and Mullah Sadra, if someone thinks, oh, we have understood the Quran, no. Ibn Arabi says that if someone has read the Quran twice and has not understood another meaning, that means he hasn't read the Quran properly.
Wow.
And there's a reason for that. There's nothing like God, so God is infinite. So how can the words of God be infinite? So the words of God cannot be infinite, because the God also says that if the trees were pen and the water in the ocean upon 7 oceans were ink, the words of God cannot be extinguished. So how can one capture the meanings of God's words? That's not possible. So that's really interesting. I mean, there's so much in it, and that's and then once one has read this, then one also needs to show humility. Humility saying, by recognizing that whatever one has studied, that's not enough. There's more to it. And continuously embrace, forgive people. That's the key thing. That we need to, in order to understand Islam, we need to A, philosophize ourselves properly what Islamic philosophy is. B, read the Quran in such a way that we recognize that there will be diverse views. And then read the seerah of the Prophet. So these are some ways. And another thing, that if someone wants to read the Quran, they need to read the study Quran, because the study Quran is based on this Muslim philosophy, the parameters. It explains all the different positions Muslim scholars have held.
Wow. Subhanallah. That's very profound. So, Doc, we've been going for almost 2.5 hours. Are there any parting words, questions, if you will, for the audience? And do tell us where we can read your thesis, if it's been published, and where we can find you in general. I know you shy away from social media, but I still managed to find you, alhamdulillah, and it's not like I've got some special superpowers. So how can the viewers or the listeners reach out to you if they so wish?
You can share my Skype account. I've given
right.
my Skype account. You can do that. My thesis is part of like, I need to, I need to submit it, and hopefully then it's publicly accessible. That takes a bit of time. One article has been published. So if you would read this, the article name is Population Size and Social Contact as Predictors of Religious Thought and Intergroup Attitudes, the Case of Muslims in 40 Countries. This was published last December. So if you would type that, you might find that. I think the best way would be Skype. I do have my Facebook account, but I don't know how to tell you, because I don't know what should I tell you within that?
Just the name will be fine, I think. Yeah.
Oh, so if you type just Syed Hammad Ali, you'll see this picture that has this like a bearded elderly person. It's a picture that reflects Ibn Arabi and Rumi and all these types of people. So you might find that. Okay. Like I said, as you can see, my answer to your question shows that I am illiterate when it comes to Facebook, how to use Facebook properly.
Well, that's because you save the literacy for things that are more important, mashallah.
Yeah, the thing is that knowledge is beneficial, that leads you to actualize the truth. You have to understand that Islam is a religion of knowledge. There is a Quranic verse which says, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَانَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. Ibn Abbas, the commentator, the student of the Prophet, explained that here يَعْبُدُونَ means يَعْلَمُونَ, to know. Now, how do you know? That is by properly seeing the world for what it is. So think about this. When people might say that this is some form of pantheism, here's the problem. The thing is that the divine is the only real. When we say La ilaha illallah, we also recognize that first we say there is no God but Him, but Allah. God Himself has said that Laysa kamithlihi shay'un, there is nothing like Him. He has also said He is the truth, huwa al-haq. So if He is the truth, there cannot be anything like Him as the truth. So in other words, there is nothing except Him. And all these are simply self-disclosures of the divine. And the path of knowledge leads us to understand how these different things that we are seeing, which are the manifestation, self-disclosure of the divine, how can we give them their proper due? Because the Prophet of Islam has emphasized that give to each that has a haq, its haq. So through knowledge, you're then able to give things its due right. And when you're able to give these things the due right, you're then able to actualize the truth. And then what happens is that, as God says in the Quran, God loves them and they love Him. And when He loves them, He becomes their eyesight through which He sees, through which the person sees, becomes the hearing through which the person hears. And what also happens to the person, because now he's being loved, and I had quoted this hadith during Mufti Abu Layth's talk as well, al-mu'min miratul mu'min. One of the attributes of God is al-mu'min. And al-mu'min is also the individual believer. So a mirror takes that form, that identity which is in front of it. So when God, al-mu'min, the person is the al-mu'min, he becomes the mirror for the divine believer, for the al-mu'min, God. Then the mirror takes the form of that al-mu'min. So what happens is that the person then takes the attributes of the divine, which is full of mercy and compassion.
SubhanAllah. Yeah, it's very, very profound. So, mashallah, we've been going at it for so long, Doc. Thank you very much once again for accepting my invite. You had no idea who I was. In fact, most of my guests don't have any idea who I am because I'm not a big YouTuber or anything, but still you accepted. And for that, I humbly thank you, because I'm so grateful that we got to have this conversation, which it's not my longest, but I would say maybe my most jam-packed yet. So definitely ending this season off for the bang. Jazakallahu khairan, Doc. Inshallah, when this pandemic is over, I invite you to come visit Botswana, inshallah. So maybe you'll get some more ammunition for another thesis for, Muslims in Southern Africa or something. So you're more than welcome to, Doc, once this pandemic is over, to come to Botswana and to stay in touch. But dear viewers, dear listeners, we hope that you had an amazing time through this, because I definitely did throughout this whole 2.5 hours. Just so much information, prioritizing mercy, looking at things from a different perspective. I learned so much through this, and I hope the viewers and the listeners, they learned so much as well. And I'm just losing words because it's been such an awesome experience. Doc, once again, Dr. Syed Hammad Ali, I know you told me to call you brother at the beginning, but it just feels so weird. So Doc, thank you very much. I appreciate it from the bottom of my heart. And I hope everyone enjoyed. So peace out, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Doc, to you as well. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Well, you reached the end. Well done. I guess I'll give you a little bit of a prize by reminding you to like, share, and subscribe to our relevant channels. Follow us on all our social media platforms. If you're using Apple Podcasts, do leave us a 5-star rating. And if you think we've earned it, we'd appreciate a one-time donation on Ko-fi or a longer pledge on Patreon. Until next time, stay blessed. Assalamu alaikum.